Right, hi everybody. Hopefully all coming through loud and clear. Apologies for the slightly weird lighting that's going on, well, it's a bit later than we usually start, and things have been very hectic today, of course, as most of you will be aware. So, yeah, I'm just going to adjust the location of this and this so that I'm vaguely looking at people while we're doing this, which usually helps. And of course, as you can see, this is episode 204, Patreon Q&A. So this should have happened at the beginning of the month, but for those of you who've been keeping up with the Drydocks, you'll know the personal circumstances why I really haven't had the time or the energy to do a live stream up until today. So as per usual with Patreon live streams, Patreon Drydock live streams, that we have alternate history questions that were asked by patrons. So we're going to go through those first. Then I'm going to take as many questions from the live chat as I can. I, of course, do have the Iron Brew to try and keep me going, but we'll see, because I have a long drive ahead of me tomorrow. I've got a video to wrap up editing today, so yeah, it's we'll see how things go. It's currently 20 to 9 in the UK, and I ideally would like to be finished before midnight. That'd be nice. Anyway, David Will 286. Basically, I would have done a straight out of question straight out of live stream Q&A live stream in the middle of the month, except of course this month, unfortunately, with my grandfather falling ill and dying, there just wasn't the time. His funeral was actually earlier this afternoon, so yeah. Next month, hopefully things will be slightly less hectic, but yeah, there'll hopefully be a few questions coming from the live chat later today. Right, let's get the Iron Brew poured. Yeah, he was my last grandparent. My two Bolivian grandparents died in the late 2000s, early 2010s. My grandmother died in 2016, and my grandfather, who passed away earlier this month, was, I mean, to be fair, he was 92. So he had a pretty good innings. But it's never a pleasant thing, even if you are kind of expecting it at 92. But we'll get on with the questions. It's a good way of coping, I think. Keeps me thinking about other things. So Martin Smith leads the questions in with saying, you're put in charge of the National Maritime Museum with sweeping powers and a large bag of money. How would you fix it? Now, that is a rather interesting one. As I've said in a few dry docks, I really, really did not approve of the way they basically kiddified it. They took away all the decent stuff. And yeah, they took away all the models, they took away all the displays. They basically made it like huge rooms with about 4 items to look at and about 6 words apiece. Now, to be fair to them, having been back post-COVID, whilst some sections still are like that, other sections have been kind of returned to the way they used to be. Not quite the way they used to be. They've basically the way it used to be laid out in a lot of the rooms was you'd go into the room and there would be 4, 5 cases, long cases running full length of the room, full of models and artifacts and stuff with explanations. Now there is, in the better halls, there's basically 2, but they have superimposed some of them, so they've got them like slightly higher up and so forth. And they do have a bit more information, and they've used the walls to put even more information there, so it's all right. They've got a really big King George V class shipbuilders model as well, which is really interesting. So if I was fixing it, I would introduce more of that, because some of the what I would call the intermediate areas, where they're not as bad as they used to be, but they're still not ideal, they've done the classic thing that a lot of museums do. They've introduced these kind of interactive zones where, well, you can't necessarily handle the artifacts, but you can handle things, replicas of the artifacts, or you can, build blocks and, move things around and everything. And they all look great when it's first launched for about a year. And then things break, and they're not fixed, and things go missing, and they're not replaced, and the baseline stuff gets broken, and it's not fixed. And 2 or 3 years down the line, there's just this sad, broken, miscellaneous lump of stuff that has instructions on how to use stuff you can't find because it hasn't been there for a year or so. So I'd get rid of those and put in more displays with some of their other collection. So some of the stuff they've obviously clearly put into storage, and so that is what I would do. Thank you very much, guys, for all your condolences there in the stream. Last of his generation, so spent most of World War II stripping down German bombers of ammunition to make fireworks. So there you go. Gives you some idea where I get my pyromania from. Admiralty of Floof asks, I remember you elaborating at quite some length on a scenario where armour, or hypothetical scenario where armour would win over gunnery. You outlined a general ship design that might emerge from that, and it reminded me of the Thunderchild as outlined or drawn by myself and the artist in the recent 5-minute guide. Is this about right or totally off? So yeah, that was a really old question. That was basically speculating on what ships would look like if, for whatever reason, armour won out over gunnery. Either they invented some kind of wonder metal that made armour impervious to any gun they could make, or perhaps, maybe gunnery, for insert magical handwave reason, didn't advance beyond the short-barreled black powder weapons of the mid to late 19th century, and thus, once things like corrupt steel came along, it would be possible to armour your entire ship against practically any weapon, except at very point-blank range. So in those circumstances, the general layout of Thunderchild as I've designed her, which is kind of inspired by things like Sansparai and Hotspur, is roughly how I would consider such a ship to have developed. Basically small, relatively small to medium size, armour obviously capable of withstanding anything but point-blank shots by the biggest guns. Then you'd have a single turret with the biggest guns and some fire-starting secondary batteries, and the objective of the ship would be to just sail as close as humanly possible whilst deflecting fire and then unload its own guns. So I'd say it might look like a more angular version of Thunderchild, maybe with some sloped sides or whatever. Thunderchild would be seen as a step in the right direction. It's not quite the ship that I outlined in the scenario, but it is very similar. Fireteam Joker asks, USS William D. Porter may be one of the most unlucky American warships in World War II. True. She topped off a disastrous few days at sea by firing a live torpedo at a ship carrying the US president. I've never heard what happened to the crew after that. I can't imagine trying to kill a president does well for one's career. It doesn't seem to have done all that much to the crew. Even in the logs of USS Iowa, the entire incident, which you can imagine probably excited quite a few people at the time, amounts to maybe 5 lines. So they just kind of recorded it and moved along. Even then they were attributing it to misfire. As I covered in the video I did on William D. Porter, the truth is somewhere in the middle. You will occasionally get people who like to think of themselves as mythbusters for everything, who will try and rationalize and explain away absolutely everything to do with the ship. And then, of course, you get the classic memeable stuff where every possible claim is made about her. The truth is somewhat in the middle. So, yeah, some of the stuff which she's supposedly got involved in almost certainly didn't happen. But some of the more spectacular and amusing stuff that's accredited to her definitely did, like, accidentally firing a torpedo at USS Iowa. But by all indications, they seem to have just written it off as a training accident with possible significant unfortunate implications, and continued on. Certainly nothing happened to the ship while she was underway, and she seems to have just continued operations afterwards. So, yeah, I mean, it's a huge kind of whoops moment, but at the same time, you know, people are willing and capable of overlooking a fair amount if it's fairly clear that no one was actually on an assassination mission. Because if anyone aboard USS Iowa had had any kind of serious inkling that, you know, the crew of the William D. Porter had suddenly decided to turn traitor, that ship would not have made harbour. Reichsbeer Minister asks, how and when did onboard refineries on battleships come into place? And do they function like land-based ones? Was there only any noticeable development until the 1950s? So by refinery, I'm taking that question to mean a thing that treats fuel and refines it into some kind of better fuel. In which case, really the only onboard refinery, if you like, at least on a warship, would be some of the systems installed on some of the diesel-powered ships, like the one that was present and then wrecked at the Battle of River Plate aboard Graf Spee. So those basically existed to be able to take on board almost anything hydrocarbon and very crude, including some forms of diesel fuel that just didn't work very well with the engines, and do a quick and dirty refinement into something that the diesel engines could use without completely gunking up. So, I mean, that's the single biggest example of them. I suspect, given that their purpose, design nature as commerce raiders, they were probably the first major warship to carry those kind of significant onboard refineries. I mean, there were diesel engine warships in World War One. U-boats are far too small to deal with that kind of stuff. You just have to fill them full of actual diesel fuel. And the Japanese certainly didn't seem to have them on their warships when they were using literally crude oil almost fresh out of the ground in the latter part of the war. And then, of course, you have the fact that Graf Spee is not a actual battleship. So, technically speaking, there were no onboard refineries on battleships, assuming we're talking about diesel fuel. If we're talking about something else, like water distillation or something like that, that's an entirely separate question. But if I've interpreted your question correctly, Reichsbeer Minister, great. If I haven't, well, you know where to drop me a message to tell me that I was completely off-piste. Brian Smith asks, during your trip to the States, what surprised you the most about the museum ships as a whole, and which individual ship surprised you the most? Okay. Individual ship that I visited that surprised me the most would probably be the USS Salem. And in a good way, because depending on which people you listen to on the internet, and I know yet listening to random people on the internet is not necessarily always good for anything, but if you listen to some of the people who are ranting, especially on various Facebook groups, about USS Salem before I left for the US, you would think that Salem was basically a gigantic pile of rust held together with paint and hopes. But then when you get there and you actually go on board, yeah, there's some cosmetic stuff that could use touching up, and the deck could probably use attention in various areas. You know, it's not in 100% tip-top perfect material condition, but it's in a heck of a lot better condition than the usual angry people online would lead you to suspect. And you can tell that the crew aboard take the great pride and great care in their ship. They're doing the absolute best they can with the hand that they've been dealt. And, you know, given that when I was working my way down through the 8-inch auto-loading system, which, let me tell you, is not something that I mean, there's hatches and ladders that allow you to do it, but I don't think it's anything that anyone was expecting you to do on a regular basis. Now, let me tell you that much. When you're working your way down through there, the fact that the only hazards really that are present are one or two systems that have, where seals have failed and they've let hydraulic fluid out or something. So you just have to steer clear of a couple of puddles of hydraulic fluid. Those seals have been intact since the ship went into reserve, and probably a bunch of them haven't been replaced for a long time before that, so they're half a century old or more. And, given that was pretty much the extent of any kind of significant hazard you encounter on Salem, that ship was hugely surprising to me, because she was in much, much better condition than you would think. And yeah, as I said, and the crew, you can see that the crew are working their hardest to get the ship into an even better state, which is really good. And the guys who work on that ship are absolutely superb people as well. As far as what surprised me the most about museum ships as a whole, I would probably have to go with not so much the museum ship conditions or the physical ships themselves, because let's face it, it's like if you're in the UK, okay, we don't have as many museum ships, but we do have a variety of museum ships in a variety of states. So seeing museum ships in a variety of states, ranging from needs a bit of a touch up to did you steal this fresh out of the dockyard, that in and of itself wasn't too surprising. I think what was the most surprising for me was just how friendly and willing to share their knowledge the various docents and other staff aboard the ships were. Because, I mean, I've filmed on, as you know, if you've watched the videos, I've filmed on various British museum ships, and I appreciate, and to be fair, I do appreciate when the staff are just like, okay, you know what you're talking about, go nuts, and they're happy to leave me wandering around the ship with a camera and chatting away. That's absolutely brilliant for me as a person, because I'm like, great, I get to explore this at my own pace, and it's also great for you guys in terms of content, because I can just set up wherever, do whatever bits, like, for example, with HMS Unicorn. But when I was on the US museum ships, there were people who served on those ships or served on similar sister ships. There were people who hadn't necessarily served on those ships, but they'd devoted 10, 15, 20 years of their lives to learning those ships inside and out. And they were all so enthusiastic about welcoming me aboard, showing me around, telling me all these little details that you would never get in any kind of technical analysis of the ships, because they're the kind of things you can only learn either by having served on the ship, by listening to people who served on the ship, or by working on the ship for so long you come across these little bits and pieces just by experiencing them. And that's a good chunk of, I think, what made the trip so enjoyable. Obviously there was meeting a variety of some of you guys I see in the chat. I know I met some of you there, and that was great as well. But really, when you're confronted, I mean, the thing is, it's like when I go to HMS Belfast, especially nowadays when I'm giving people speed tours around the ship, I could navigate, like, you could have a power cut and I could navigate through that ship, so I know it front to back. And to be fair, it's a town class cruiser. It's large, but even by simple trial and error, you'd find your way out relatively quickly if you had to. Whereas, you get on board a South Dakota class battleship or an Iowa class battleship. If you got lost down on like the second platform level, you could spend an awful long time and not find your way out. I mean, at some point when I get to do the video on USS Massachusetts, I'll have to tell everybody about the way we thought someone else had gotten lost and stuck in the ship, and how long it took us just to track down the guy who was yelling, and as it turned out was actually yelling for us because we'd stayed down there for so long our better halves had thought we'd died or something. Yeah, so yeah, that I think that probably covers that question. And yeah, Chuck Marble, hello, and yeah, again, pleasure to meet you aboard the Iowa. Yeah, well, the less said about that, the better. Well, not about meeting yourself, but yeah, about the incident you mentioned. It's just, well, we move on from things. Graham Houghton asks, C.S. Forrester of Hornblower fame wrote The Good Shepherd, a World War II story. Do the details hold up to historical or technical scrutiny? I'm going to have to park that question because it's been so long since I read the thing. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, I think that's the book they actually adapted into Greyhound. As of what I recall, most of the stuff in there is relatively accurate. But as I said, it's been a very long time since I read it, so yeah. Yeah, Josh Thomas Moore. Yeah, the party, myself, the cameraman, and the two docents who were showing us around. We were launching a rescue party for someone else who would actually who'd actually come to rescue us. Also, interesting enough, the acoustics inside the depths of a South Dakota class battleship can turn what's actually basically a kind of "Hello, is anyone here?" yell into something that sounds like, you know, the haunting of the damned, which is interesting to say the least. Sebastian Danes, I think. Danes? I don't know. Danes? Well, by this point, you probably know who you are because I've got it right somewhere along the lines. Why do you think naval miniature war games like Victory at Sea, or even simulations like World of Warships, are never as popular as their army counterparts like Flames of War, Bolt Action, etc.? Even fantasy sci-fi naval games like Star Wars Armada are no longer supported, whilst Legion and X-Wing are still coming out with new releases. Model warships are awesome, but as an avid gamer I've noticed they're far less popular than armies full of tanks and infantry. What are your thoughts on this, and how can that genre become popular? I think there's a decent element of anthropomorphization that goes on in wargaming. Because, I mean, let's face it, an awful lot of stuff that is in wargaming involves bipedal humanoid figures. And even when you get stuff that isn't bipedal humanoid figures, I don't know, the Tyranids, for example, they're still recognizably living creatures of some description, and so people get attached to them and start to project either their own personality or a personality they've made up for that particular character in some way onto them. And therefore they feel more attached to them. It's a bit easier to get involved in something where you feel you have a personal stake in it, whereas in order to feel that kind of connection and personal stake to a model game system that involves ships, you actually have to know some of the history, the lore, if you like, beforehand. Whereas with land-based war games, you can learn the lore afterwards. You know, look at the way you give kids something like, you give kids little toy soldiers, and they don't have to know even where they're from. They could be classic US Army green men. They could be Space Marines. They could be they could be World War II infantry. They could be drop zone commander characters. And they'll just be like, oh yeah, play, and maybe 5-6 years later they actually bother to find out what the lore behind them is. Whereas you give them ships and they're like, well, it's a thing. And I think possibly also in terms of detail and painting, because a ship, any ship, even down to something like a PT boat, is considerably larger than a person or a tank or anything like that. So if you scale them down to a point where you can actually play with any significant number of them, they become very fiddly and very fragile and very and somewhat more difficult to paint than a humanoid character or a tank that's basically a box with tracks. And so there tends to be a slightly higher skill level involved to painting them. So yeah, I have a feeling those are the two main causes, but that's me largely speculating based on 2 decades as a wargamer. Because of course, being a ship fanatic, my tastes run into all sorts of things. But for example, I do collect 40k quite avidly. But although I have various 40k armies, I would say of all the stuff I've collected, I'm actually more attached to my Adeptus Titanicus and my Battlefleet Gothic collections than I am to my 40k and Horus Heresy collections, because I like ships and so on and so forth. Todd Webb, and I am collecting the super chats, by the way, so I will answer those when I get through the Patreon questions. Todd Webb asks, during the US Civil War, the King of Siam offered the US military a number of war elephants to aid in the war against slavery. Lincoln ended up declining the offer as the US had no experience with war elephants, but had the US wanted war elephants, did either the US Navy or the Kingdom of Siam have ships that could have brought a useful number of war elephants across the Pacific? Yes. Actually, the USN very definitely could, because a good chunk of the ocean-going US Navy by kind of midway through the American Civil War was merchant steamers, the better ones, that they had basically taken into service and pressed into service as what we today would probably call armed merchant cruisers. And so it wouldn't be a huge stretch if, for whatever reason, they decided, yes, let's have war elephants involved in the American Civil War. We're cosplaying Hannibal here. They could have detached one of the bigger, USS, insert name here, converted steamers and gone, okay, we're going to take this thing and we're going to run it across the ocean and we're just going to fill its cargo holds with elephants for reasons. On the one hand, it would have been absolutely hilarious to see, a Union general with a battle standard flying from a howdah with, an elephant with a couple of small Dahlgrens strapped to its back. On the other hand, artillery had gotten accurate, at least in terms of line of sight, kind of sub 1,000-yard artillery, that I don't think they would have survived very long. Which, yeah, that would have been a bit unfortunate. Unless they use them as ambush forces. I'm not entirely sure how you hide a herd of war elephants, but given the size of the earth, some of the earthworks that were built in the US Civil War and some of the forests, you might have been able to pull it off, and I can guarantee you this much. Oh, yeah, actually, a herd of war elephants bursting out of the trees when the howdahs have been equipped with about half a dozen Gatling guns. That would be what you call an outside context problem. That would have been... I would have paid money to see that movie. Right after someone does a full movie of that T-Rex that served at D-Day. Stephen Rizika asks, would Bismarck have been as legendary as she is today had she not had the torpedo hit her rudder that set up the final battle and subsequently survived and made it to France? I think it depends on what her final fate would have been. She would have been very famous for sinking Hood. Depending on the exact circumstances of her escape, that could actually have added to her legend, but it then depends greatly on what happens to her afterwards. If it's a case of, stays in Brest for a bit and some gets bombed or torpedoed, a bit like Gneisenau was, and then sinks, it's kind of a bit of a damp squib end to the story. If she goes in with the Channel Dash and then hits a bunch of mines and gets possibly disabled or whatever, or she makes it through like Scharnhorst and Gneisenau historically did, but then she gets bombed in port and basically wrecked like Gneisenau was. Anywhere where her story kind of comes to this kind of very damp squib ending, her legend would probably fade out a fair bit. If she was tall-boyed along with Tirpitz, or at roughly the same time as Tirpitz, she'd probably have a legend, but not quite as much of one as what she did. If, however, she hangs around and maybe she's there instead of Scharnhorst at the Battle of the North Cape, and she goes down guns blazing, fighting Duke of York and all of her friends, then her legend might be even greater. Kind of, it's the rematch time, and big glorious final battle. That might actually have made her even more legendary. BL Class 47 is pointing out Tirpitz is still well known. Yeah, Tirpitz is still well known, but Bismarck is better known than Tirpitz, let's face it. Cat2V asks, at Jutland, if Jellicoe either guesses correctly or is properly informed of the High Seas Fleet's course at night and adjusts his own appropriately, and at dawn the Grand Fleet wins the decisive battle, taking some losses, but destroying up to 2/3 of Germany's capital ships in a second Trafalgar, how does this great victory affect British construction through the rest of World War I and the interwar years? Does it have any additional effect on tactical and strategic thinking in World War II? And do either of the above change if Jellicoe and or Beatty are killed in the battle? Random aside, in this scenario, would Iron Duke have been preserved beside victory? If you'd had a Trafalgar-like decisive battle with a great victory for the Royal Navy, yes, Iron Duke almost certainly would have been preserved alongside victory. Bear in mind, victory was initially had the big preservation works done in the 1920s, when people were appreciating what she'd done at the time, and Iron Duke was she was still in service at that point, but she was heading for reserve. So towards the end of the 1920s, I could see her being paired up along with Victory in Portsmouth Dockyard. That certainly could happen. Britain could afford it at that point. If Jellicoe or Beatty are killed in battle, then whoever is killed in battle would probably get, it's basically the Nelson scenario, death at the peak of your career by bringing decisive victory. So especially if it's Jellicoe, he might very well end up being ranked as the second Nelson, depending on what, if Beatty is killed, I think it's depending on what he is doing at the time. If he's killed by a random stray shell and the British battlecruisers aren't actually doing all that much in that dawn fight, he'll still be very famous, but not quite as much as maybe if Jellicoe was killed. If he's killed, leading a death or glory charge to cut off the High Seas Fleet to buy time for the rest of the Grand Fleet to catch up, then of course, yeah, he'll be the one who's getting immortalised anyway. Just copying a couple of those. Now, in terms of how does that victory affect British construction throughout the rest of World War I and the interwar years, if they're taking some losses, then you are going to see various projects either continue or be started. So, for example, the Admiral class, if, say, half a dozen Royal Navy capital ships are sunk in addition to, the battle cruisers that already lost, just to make up the numbers, then all four admirals are going to be completed. Yes, they might be considered a little bit out of date compared to what could be built, but it'll be a case of we need those numbers. Plus, given the scale of the various ships and their ability to resist damage, it's statistically more likely that some of the older 12-inch ships would go down. Now, if a bunch of those have gone down, maybe a few of the 13.5s as well, again, you're still going to need replacements, because if you lose half a dozen to 6 to 10 capital ships, in addition to all the stuff you've already lost during the previous day's engagements, just 4 Admiral class is not going to make up those losses, so they're probably going to have to do a modified repeat of the QEs or the Rs, depending on how much money they're feeling like spending. Theoretically, yes, they could design a better capital ship, but they're going to want to get these things in the water as quickly as possible, so refreshing an existing design would be faster. And and they might use that as an opportunity to consolidate the fleet earlier, basically saying, you know, the battle has proven that the 12-inch ship no longer has a place in the battle line. However, we still have a bunch of these 12-inch ships, so not only are we going to have to replace battlefield losses, but we're also going to have to perhaps look at decommissioning Dreadnought, the Bellerophons, the St. Vincents, Colossus Hercules, etc., Neptune, at which point... Where the heck does that go? Oh, it's over there. At which point... then you're going to need at least a class, if not two more, on top of your replacement class to make up the numbers. In terms of tactical strategic thinking in World War II, well, if it's been proven that a gun line decisive battle can take place, then it's probably going to retrench the view that they should be aiming for that even more so in World War II. Of course, the fact that no one outside of Italy by World War II in the European theatre could even think about having a stand-up gun-line decisive battle with anybody in terms of the Axis powers, and of course the Japanese could try it in the Pacific. Yeah, it'd be an interesting one, because 20 years is a lot of time for, as we saw, for technological change to happen. I think there still would be there would be more of a push towards let's have a big gunfight. But simultaneously, the fact that you could lose most of your fleet so quickly in a major decisive battle is going to make a lot of people reach for anything that could be considered to be a secret weapon, an advantage over the other. At which point, paradoxically, you might see even more emphasis on aircraft carriers, because they would be viewed as the things that might be able to, they might be able to give you that extra punch in your engagement that could tip the balance over your way. So that's about 30% of the Patreon questions done. Colin Williams asks, it's May 1942 and an unescorted USS Phoenix has just taken 2 Mark 8 torpedoes in a case of friendly fire. Attempting to make the conditions as similar as possible while accounting for US Navy doctrine at the time, can the US crew save her, and how much of a factor is there in her being 40 years younger? If she still sinks, if the time of the strike is 44-45, how much difference does that make? And if she has escorts, how much of a difference does that make? Just copying a few questions. Just double checking something. I'm just checking where those torpedoes actually hit. Blah 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 blah. Okay, so one torpedo hits 40 foot aft of the bow. That's eminently survivable. I mean, we know that various US cruisers had their bows blown off in the Guadalcanal campaign and walked away from it, so that's fine. The second one strikes 3/4 of the way aft, just past the armor plate, and explodes in the aft machinery room. Damaged electrical power system, 4 bulkheads held. Water couldn't be pumped out because of electrical power failure, and we're sailing with watertight doors open. Okay, so that kind of damage is not great, but I think Maine, I mean, she had a she had her bulkhead doors open. I don't think even in May 1942 a US crew is going to be making that mistake. Certainly not by 44-45. And even with an electrical power failure, definitely the 44-45 crew, and especially if they've got escorts, they will still have the portable pumps. So, yeah, I think if the strike happens in 44 or 45, and or she has escorting destroyers with her, she'd probably survive. I think the damage control efforts would be good enough that she could definitely stand a good chance of surviving, and she's got enough damage control equipment to at least keep, not necessarily stem, but at least keep ahead of the flooding a bit until help can arrive. And of course in the second situation that's very close at hand. In May 42, when the portable pumps are a little bit less widespread, the crew are a little bit greener, she'd be at more risk of foundering, but at the same time some US cruisers at Guadalcanal suffered similar, if not worse, and just about made it. So while I wouldn't be putting any money on her surviving the strikes in May 42, I wouldn't be necessarily surprised if she did. And if it was a late war USS Phoenix that takes those same hits, yeah, I would actually put money on her surviving. Onboard G1, that would be the Mars-class battlecruiser. He's asking what's my favourite Battlefleet Gothic ship. DM Carpenter says, if I recall correctly, Belgrano had other subdivision issues due to below-decks ventilation modifications. Well, that's a bane of almost any refitted old ship, but yeah. Donovan asks, what never-built ship do you think would have made an excellent museum ship? Depends how plausible or implausible you want to go. I mean, if you want to stay within the realms of the plausible, i.e. ships that were either underway being built when they were scrapped, or ships that were very seriously planned, even if the keels were never laid. I mean, a Minotaur class cruiser would be interesting. Lots of automation. Probably by the time it made it into service would have had a big hangar deck stuck on the back, kind of like the Tigers did. But it would be big enough to be, and substantial enough to actually be kind of a self-contained actual museum as well as a museum ship, in a way that some of the US museum ships have done. So that would be quite interesting. I'd say a Lexington class battlecruiser, but then with the Iowas around, the kind of very long, heavily 16-inch armed vessel bracket is already covered. A never-built ship that would have made an excellent museum ship, I think, probably would have been the Atlanta successors that were being planned for, well, Atlanta-Oakland successors that were being planned for the immediate post-war environment, because of just the sheer number of gun turrets. They could have told a lot of different stories based around the same kind of environments. Yeah, the problem is a lot of cruisers and battleships that were never built, most of them are just kind of slightly larger or slightly different iterations, so you can make the same arguments for other things as them. But I think things like the Minotaurs or the whatever the Atlanta-Oakland successors were called, because they're interesting in and of themselves and very unique, and we don't have anything like them preserved, those would have made really good museum ships. Lord Nelson asks, In 1916, several merchantmen carrying explosives to Woolwich Arsenal blow up, starting a giant fire that burns through London. With casualties dwarfing the ongoing slaughter at the Somme and the prospect of losing the very core of Britain's wealth, a desperate, panicky, scorched government decides to pull in every fire team to help, including the crews of the entire Grand Fleet and most other capital ships around the British Isles. Including travel time, they'll remain away from their posts for roughly a month. This, of course, does not go unnoticed on the other side of the North Sea. Now you, newly appointed head of the High Seas Fleet, Grosser Admiral Drydock, are given total freedom of operations to make use of this golden opportunity. Well, it depends how quickly my ships are able to set sail, really, because, I mean, the problem is that if we're going to talk about realistically, the British still have room 40, even if it might have relocated if London's on fire. If the High Seas Fleet sails, the British will know about it. And emergency trains can travel a lot faster than fleets of ships can. So in terms of getting, the immediate temptation would be to send the fleet to Scapa Flow and try and obliterate the Grand Fleet as it swings at anchor on skeleton crews. However, I think in any realistic scenario, unless Room 40 completely drops the ball, if that happens, then regardless of how badly needed or not the Grand Fleet's crews are to help put London out, they would be packed on trains and sent hurtling back up north as fast as humanly possible to get back to their ships before the Germans did. If I was... I'm obviously applying hindsight here, but if I was the Germans, I would deploy the High Seas Fleet as much as I could, but the very first thing I would do would be to send out every ready destroyer and cruiser that I've got, so the ships that are going to be quicker to get going, and then follow up with the first scouting group and the High Seas Fleet. And my main objective would be to completely and utterly destroy two things. One, my cruisers and destroyers are going up to destroy the Northern Blockade. And two, my heavy units are heading down into the Channel to wipe out the Harwich Force and the various older ships that the Royal Navy and the French have guarding the transports that are going back and forth between the UK and France, supplying the armies in France with men, ammunition, equipment, and bringing back the wounded. So if I can rule the Channel for a week, shooting everything up, and completely disrupting the supply line to the British units in France, and I can completely tear apart the Northern Blockade, then it doesn't really matter at that point if the Grand Fleet sets sail, because the two things that were bottling me up in oceanic terms are gone, and the land army's having a lot of an easier time because the British forces will be running short of supplies. So yeah, that would be my kind of golden opportunity exploitation. Mr. V, I remember you answering a question about any ship going back 10 years a few months ago. It made me think, what if the USS Lexington was suddenly sent back 10 years from 27 to 17 with its full complement of aircraft? How would this affect the future of various navies? 1927, just completed, a bunch of biplanes and aircraft. Yeah, it's going to point people toward the idea of, one, it is possible to build carriers that large, and two, that they are very useful. Because remember, in 1917, they're still thinking in terms of Furious with her flying off deck, and then later Furious with a landing deck and a flying off deck, whereas Lexington, with a starboard mounted island, a huge through deck, big hangars, high speed, large hull size, she is obviously a conversion, so not entirely, but for the most part she is a epitome of all the lessons that they had to learn between 1917 and the mid-1920s as to what made a good carrier. So that it basically gives everyone a heads up in, it gives people an idea of what are the best ships to look for carrier conversions, how to trunk the funnels in the best way possible, what kind of things can be achieved, and how to lay out your carriers. All this stuff that, Argus and Furious and Hermes and Courageous and Glorious and Hosho and Langley, etc., all experimenting with. Now all of those questions are answered. So that would be the best way of doing it, I think. That would be the best outcome. Ferrato Victrix asks, you've been charged with creating the Olympic Games for warships, covering both their combat and sailing capabilities. What headline events would you have for these categories, and which ship classes will be eligible to compete with them for each of the periods the channel covers? I mean, that's a huge question. But if I was creating a basic Olympic Games for warships, there'd have to be something to do with maneuvering. There'd have to be something to do with acceleration. So basically a short distance sprint, who can cover the distance from start the quickest. There'd also have to be a long duration speed event, because you're going to have stuff like destroyers which will dominate the short distance events, whereas something like a cruiser will probably have a much more of an advantage in the long distance events. You've obviously got to have gunnery accuracy, probably on rate of fire competitions. You're going to have to split it up probably by ship designation. So, battleships, carriers, heavy cruisers, light cruisers, destroyers are going to have their own separate categories. What other things could you do? You can't really test protection in something like an Olympic Games event. What you could do as well as the general gunnery that you could test, you could also do kind of, I think if I remember correctly, in the US the term is a 3-gun tournament, where you shoot at different targets with different types of guns. I think it's like a pistol, a rifle, and a shotgun. You could have something like that, where a ship is moving along and it has to engage a target at long range with its main battery, and then once it's hit that target, it has to engage another target at shorter range with its secondary battery, and then once it's hit that, someone unleashes a little remote control aircraft, and it has to shoot it down with its anti-aircraft battery. So yeah, those would be my candidates for a warship Olympic Games. Wayland Chow asks, suppose FDR does not get his way and the 8 Independence-class aircraft carriers are instead completed as Cleveland-class light cruisers, how might this substitution affect the course of World War II? Excuse me. Just getting rid of a couple of bots. Right, so Independence class being completed as Cleveland's. I mean, it's going to slightly delay. It's not going to substantially delay the US rollout, but it will somewhat delay them, because remember, as you would have seen from the graphs from the US Navy ship construction videos earlier in the past couple of weeks, whilst there weren't that many of them, they did come into service relatively quickly. So they gave the US carrier forces a bit of a shot in the arm in some kind of late 43 in terms of both flight decks available and numbers of aircraft they could put up. Without them, you've still got Essex and her subsequent successors coming online, but at that point the US would probably be spending most of 1943 rebuilding its pre-existing carrier force. Essex is replacing Lexington, and so on and so forth down the line, as replacements for Yorktown and Hornet and Wasp are all coming in. And then only then can you start building your carrier decks up beyond the point at which you had your pre-war fleet. So it would probably delay the US's total ability to push back against the Japanese. But at the same time, there are so many Essexes coming down the line, probably by a matter of maybe 6 to 8 months, which you never know what breathing room that might buy the Japanese. And of course, also, even once you have that force built up, it also limits your ability to conduct multiple independent operations, because when you had early 44, historically had a fair number of Essexes in service, plus the Independences, you could build up some fairly substantial carrier groups, and you could have other carrier groups running around doing other things. Now you can't do that. So it would slow things down, but it would be slowing things down, I think, in the order of months rather than years. Nicholas Rassar asks, in the recent Armchair Admirals on British battle cruisers, Dr. Clark around 1 minute 52 in mentioned Bismarck. If it hadn't been torpedoed running into British destroyers, could you elaborate? I thought it was only the damage from the torpedo that allowed the British forces to catch up to Bismarck. It depends which forces you're talking about, because the destroyers were in a better place to intercept Bismarck in the first place, and of course they are faster outside of bad weather, whereas King George V and Rodney definitely needed Bismarck to be slowed up in order to be able to overhaul it. So if Bismarck hadn't been torpedoed, but as long as she was still detected and had her location known, even proceeding at full speed, there's a reasonable chance that the British destroyer flotilla that caught up with her would have caught up with her at some point. Whether or not that would have been before she entered Luftwaffe air cover, who knows? And also, to be honest, if she hadn't taken that torpedo hit, would she have gone on that exact course? Who knows? But on average, yeah, the destroyer squadron started out in a position and with a speed such that even an undamaged Bismarck, they could certainly make an interception attempt. Whether or not they actually managed it is another matter. Bill Luster asks, if for some reason coal and steam had proven impractical for naval warship use, how do you think sailing warships would have evolved into the 20th century? Could sailing dreadnoughts have become a thing, or was HMS Captain a sign that turrets and rigging and sails don't mix? Without coal and steam for naval propulsion, you do have some fairly major problems, mostly because with the advent of the armor and so forth, ships were becoming a lot harder to move. So you look at some of the 1870s, 1880s, the last Royal Navy ships that you see that were that had full sail rigs. Now they're carrying very heavy guns. They're carrying an awful lot of armor. They are becoming harder and harder to handle, and their speed under sail is also dropping. So you see, even though you have ships that still are equipped with a fair bit of sail for quite some time thereafter, it's around about that time that you see the last Royal Navy ship that actually enters harbour under full sail rather than using its engines, because it's getting more and more complex, more and more difficult, and things are getting more and more ponderous. Whether or not you could rig enough sail on something the size of a dreadnought to get it moving at any substantial speed, I don't know. Probably not in practical terms. I mean, yeah, technically you can rig sails on steel warships. It has actually been done to help them get moving, but you're not going to be going anywhere fast, certainly. And, you know, with the advent of quick-firing secondaries and such, sails would have been so obviously and so easily a target. You would have ended up in a very weird position if you couldn't have motive power for insert reason here, but you still were able to invent quick-firing guns and heavy steel armor. Ships would be really, really easy to disable. October Nid asks, you've referred in the past to creating more Vanguard class by dismantling the R's when they were ready. Was this a documented Royal Navy plan or just a logical move for them to consider? And what could be taken from the ships to speed construction? Could any of the armour be used, for instance? And lastly, do you think the Royal Navy would have tried to keep the names, i.e. Revenge turned into Vengeance? I don't think the Royal Navy would have been particularly fussed about keeping the names or transliterating the names over into something similar. In terms of, was it a Royal Navy plan? They did have, yes, basically it was. They did have plans to potentially build more Vanguards, and the only source of quick source of 15-inch guns was, at that point the only source of 15-inch guns would have been from decommissioned R class. So reconditioning the turrets, that definitely obviously would save time. In terms of what else might speed up ships construction, lots of random fixtures and fittings, ventilation systems, the stuff they have in the messes and accommodation areas, speed indicators, things like that would be fine. You wouldn't want the machinery. It might be tempting to try and reuse the armour, but bearing in mind the armour plates are shaped to the hull of that particular ship, so that's probably not going to work out very well. Some of it, if you're ripping up the R-Class, some of the deck armour plate might be useful. So, yeah, there'd be bits and pieces you could take off, but perhaps not as much as you might otherwise think. John Lubbers asks, the Omaha class were built after World War I and had 90,000 horsepower driving 7,000 tons to 35 knots. The Abdiels were built in early World War II and had 72,000 horsepower driving 3,400 tons to 40 knots. If some crazed US admiral was willing to refit the Omahas in 1940-41, then they saw the Abdiels, thought they were the best idea ever, and promptly had a hold my beer moment, how fast could the Omahas have been made to go, assuming they're being refitted into some kind of super Abdiel, i.e. high-speed mine layer troop transport submarine tender? This can include even removing or changing the armament and other significant changes. Given this conversion task, that's a fairly long question. Given this conversion task, what modifications would you make, and what would your vision be of how to use these ships in the war? Okay, so if I have to refit an Abdiel into an Omaha class, first off, I don't think I'm getting it up to 40 knots, because the Omahas are a product of the post-war US Navy. Yes, machinery has advanced considerably from immediately after World War I to 1940-41, but it hasn't advanced as much as it had from, say 1914 to 1941. So stripping out and replacing all the machinery on a square foot to square foot basis with modern machinery would buy me a bunch more horsepower. But, it gets exponentially harder to push a ship through the water as you go up into these kind of speed regimens. In terms of reducing the armament, if you're going to try and turn them into US Abdiels, i.e. fast mine layers, I would be tempted to then strip out all of the armament, remove the armament completely, casement guns, twin turrets, etc., and probably replace it with 4 or 5 twin 5-inch 38 mounts, all on the centre line. So that's going to save me some weight, which is going to make my attempts to get up to speed easier. There's not a tremendous amount of armour to get rid of, but you might, if you're rearming the ship that way, you might be able to trim some armour here or there. Definitely trim down some of the superstructure. And between that, the rearmament and better machinery, you might be able to push it. I'd be confident, I think, just off ballpark, of getting them up to 38 knots. Not sure I can maybe get them to 40, but you never know. It'd be something that would be possible. But you'd really have to be pushing the boat out. As in, it's not physically impossible to do, but I think you'd probably end up being creating the world's biggest speedboat rather than any kind of effective warship. Because the other thing is, whilst the Omahas are designed for high speed, there's designed for 35 knots and there's designed for 40 knots. That does have significant changes to how you would design the hull form. So we are now 60% of the way through the Patreon questions. Fluffy Goat asks, way back in the 80s, my dad was still in the Navy Reserve, and one time he brought home from his 2 weeks a year duty drawings of a planned upgrade proposal for the Iowas. This upgrade replaced all the 5-inch guns with vertical launch Tomahawks, basically creating a guided missile battleship with something like 130 missiles, but the biggest change would have been replacing the aft 16-inch turret with an angled flight deck and a hangar for Harriers. My question is, have you ever seen or heard of this proposal, or am I crazy? Also, if attempted, how insane would this upgrade have been from a cost, engineering, practicality perspective? Yes, the Harrier Carrier Iowa. That is, believe it or not, actually something that they were definitively looking into. And there were a bunch of sketches and drawings prepared. Just reminding myself of that thing. The Tomahawks one, replacing all the 5-inch with vertical launch Tomahawks, that I'm less familiar with, but given the amount of crazy stuff they thought of for the Iowas at various points, it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest that they possibly also consider that. Now, in terms of how useful that would have been, I mean, you know my thoughts on battle carriers generally, but if it's supposed to take maybe just under 24 Harriers, the main thing I would be interested in is exactly how long that flight deck actually was, because let me just check the Invincible class. So the Invincible class carriers, which are obviously, basically full length, they are 689 foot long. So the flight deck itself is probably 660. Although not all of that is needed for Harrier operations. An Iowa is 860 foot long, possibly slightly more. So, given some of the designs that they were coming up with, yeah, you could do it. You could, you could actually do it. The main question at that point would be why. What use would it be? I mean, 20 Harriers. Okay, it's the similar kind of attack flight group to what an Invincible can put up, but the US Navy isn't exactly short of flight decks. There are two potential roles I could see for a Harrier Carrier Iowa. One would be the ultimate US Marine Corps support vessel. So if you modernize the secondary battery in whatever way you wanted to, but at that point you've got something that combines the flight carrying power of a large amphib with the shore fire support of a 16-inch gun battery, etc. I'm sure the US Marines would love to have one or two of those in their inventory. The other alternative would be also some kind of self-escorting convoy escort for a theoretical attack on the Reforger convoys, maybe? Basically, kind of doing a weaken guard against surface attack and also basically be an Invincible class. But yeah, so basically, yes, it was a realistic design it was a design that they realistically considered, but it would have had some very, very niche applications. Galdia, pointing out the Navy probably would have sunk her herself before handing her over to the US Marines. Well, Adam Bowman also pointing out that Ryan over at Battleship New Jersey did a video on the battle carrier. I'll have to find that one. I must have missed it somehow. And Grey Ghost saying, have you ever heard of Caligula's Lake Nemi floating palaces in Italy? Yes, I have. At some point I want to visit the museum about them. The Freaker 86 asks, compared to the Allies, there are very few Axis power vessels coming across my mind that survived past World War II. Yeah, most of them got blown up. After the war, most of them were broken up, scuttled, or spent as targets, and even fewer survived until today as museum ships, especially capital ships like Prince Eugen or Nagato. If Prince Eugen or Nagato hadn't been nuked after World War II, do you see any chance that they would have been able to survive to the present day as museum ships? And if so, where would they be most likely, in your opinion? If the Japanese had been given Nagato back, I can actually see them turning her into a museum ship. Possibly. I don't think the Germans would have kept Prince Eugen, honestly. I mean, they had an opportunity to get the ex-Goeben back. And in terms of who did that ship fight for, she was a far less problematic candidate than Prince Eugen, which of course had spent its entire active career under the flag of the Nazis, and they didn't get her back. So yeah, I don't think the West German government at the time would have gone for keeping Prince Eugen around. But I definitely can see the Japanese sticking Nagato in there somewhere as a shrine to all of their servicemen. Thank you very much, Skep. A Salty Potato asks, had Kitakami and her sister been sent in during the Guadalcanal campaign, when do you think they would have had the most impact on the outcome? And for that matter, why weren't they sent in? Her broadside alone could have demolished an entire American task force if it was well aimed. Well, the Japanese were using Kitakami and Oi over at Truk kind of to hold the line there in some ways so that they could release multiple other ships off for duties in around the Guadalcanal area. Also, remember, the Japanese were wedded to the idea of having their big decisive battle for quite a while, and Kitakami and Oi were basically specifically designed for this. So yeah, that you don't feed them into the meat grinder of Guadalcanal if you think you're going to need them for a decisive battle sometime soon. TM. If you were going to send them in, when would they have made the most difference? I would say probably the single greatest point of difference they could have made would have been the 2-day naval battle of Guadalcanal, i.e. the one that starts off with Atlanta and San Francisco and Lafayette, etc., taking on Hiei, and then the second where Admiral Lee takes Washington and Kirishima in. Takes Washington and South Dakota in to take on Kirishima. If they'd been present in either of those, and mag dumped their torpedo launchers into the water, thus almost certainly taking out a few more US ships, that could have been a major turning point in the campaign, because remember, the force that was sent in first under Admiral Callahan was kind of a scratch force that had been put together because of the losses that previous forces had taken. And if that gets wiped out, well, they're going to end up sending in South Dakota and Washington anyway, because that basically was the response to the losses they took in that first action. And if you have 40, 80 torpedoes being dumped into the water, the statistical odds of South Dakota and or Washington getting away drop a lot quicker. So if they're able to get a pair of decisive victories because they've basically torpedoed everything in sight in those two battles, that could put a major dent in US operations for quite some time, especially if they're able to get those torpedoes in the water before Kirishima is turned into a colander. So, yeah. Camino John asks, so he's asking about a possibility of Copenhagening the Germans before World War One. And then he mentions, I came across the Texas City, Texas disaster in 1947 when a reactivated Liberty ship SS Grand Camp, loaded with 2,300 tons of ammonium nitrate, equivalent to just under a kiloton of TNT, caught fire and exploded, making it one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history. Whilst reviewing other similar explosions, the 1921 Oppau explosion, where people used dynamite to break up solidified ammonium nitrate, yeah, that would have ended well, and more recently the Beirut disaster, I came to the conclusion that people were blasé because it's only fertilizer. Now, combine the two ideas. It seems to me that government could build a small fleet of large cargo ships to engage in the ammonium nitrate trade, but have a few ships strategically holding position at any given time until relieved by another ship, thus having a first strike weapon available at any given time. From my best estimates, the maximum amount of ammonium nitrate from World War I would be around 5,000 tons, whilst World War II would be around 20,000 tons, meaning you have 2 and 8 kilotons worth of bang at your disposal. Keep in mind that only the captain and first officer would be aware of the mission, while the rest of the crew would be well trained in firefighting and proper handling of stuff. Question: which nations in World War I or World War II would have benefited from having such a fleet of ships? 2. Which targets would you pick to destroy or damage to cause the greatest impact at the outset of war? And 3. What immediate actions would have to occur afterwards to make it worthwhile? Whew, that was a long question. Basically, the single biggest problem with the idea is that fire ships, essentially, they are a relatively old concept. Most naval bases, whilst there may have been civilian harbours nearby, most of the major naval bases are either completely separate or in segregated areas of the harbour. And a ship that's packed full of explosives will tend to go boom if you fire on it even a little. So, I mean, it's a nice idea in theory. The problem is that cargo ships are relatively slow, and you'd have to have an awful lot of explaining to do if you were trying to sail a random cargo ship into a naval area without it being stopped and boarded or just shot. And that goes doubly so for things like Scapa Flow, where there's no reason for an ammonium nitrate carrier to be. I mean, during World War I, I think the only nation that I can think of offhand that would have benefited realistically in terms of actually being able to pull something off might have been Britain or France. And I wouldn't have used them to target the enemy's fleets. But you could have used them if you had a bunch of ships that were loaded with ammonium nitrate. You could maybe sail them into position under cover of darkness in the Dardanelles during the Gallipoli campaign, before, obviously, you land any troops, and basically detonate your way to victory. I mean, we've all seen what happened with the Beirut explosion. If you're able to pull off a bunch of those all along the length of the Dardanelles, then send your ships or troops in, you'd probably have a much easier time of the landings, and there's a reasonable chance the shockwave might also detonate a bunch of the mines in the channel as well. In World War II, I mean, the obvious question of could you get an ammonium nitrate freighter into Pearl Harbor? Probably not. The US was on a fairly alert footing prior to Pearl Harbor, especially in terms of things coming in by sea. Likewise, the British had lots of patrols on their harbours. The Germans don't have too many harbours. I mean, again, weirdly enough, the people who are most likely to benefit would maybe be the British, who paradoxically obviously have a fairly large fleet already, because, well, if you think 4 tons is bad enough to take out the dock at Saint-Nazaire, if they somehow manage to cosplay as a German freighter and sneak an 8 kiloton and ammonium nitrate bomb into Saint-Nazaire, well, I mean, it would really, really do a number on the Saint-Nazaire Drydock. However, I don't think the mission would be remembered quite as fondly as it is these days, because 1, there'd be almost certainly no survivors of the expedition, and 2, there would be an awful lot of collateral damage. It basically just comes down to there's a lot of very tempting targets, but that last stage of getting a slow freighter that obviously shouldn't be there close enough to a military base for for even an 8 kiloton explosion to make a difference is very difficult. People point out the Halifax explosion, etc. But the thing was, that ship full of explosives in Halifax was supposed to be there. It just wasn't supposed to explode. And Halifax was not a major naval dockyard at the time. It had been in the past, but it wasn't at that point. And Tyler Kuhn asking, what if the Japanese used a bomb ship like that to destroy the Panama Canal? That's a possibility. Actually, that is the one possibility, because it would be perfectly legitimate for an ammonium nitrate freighter to be transiting the Panama Canal, and if it just happened to blow up, especially in and around the lock gates, and completely wreck that, it would certainly put a crimp in the US ability to make war, albeit that cargo would probably then be shifted by rail. They'd probably build some kind of emergency rail system from the Caribbean to the west coast. They'd start work on repairing the Panama Canal, and ultimately destroying the Panama Canal adds several months to the transit times of US ships getting to the Pacific, but it doesn't stop them getting to the Pacific. So it would delay the US war efforts, but it's not going to stop them completely. Andre Gardner, I'm afraid I don't understand that question, so please message me afterwards and try to explain it a bit more. Phil G, how would the war in the Pacific theatre have been shaped, planned, or changed for the US Navy if one person, admiral or general, had been the sole arbiter? The main thing, I think, well, basically that's kind of the main thing there is, what if MacArthur wasn't in charge of his section of the Pacific, in which case, everything would have been a lot simpler. There would have been one set of plans to work towards, far less argumentation. Things, in theory, would go more smoothly. About the only sort of caveat to all of that is that, yes, everything might go a lot more smoothly, plans might be put together a lot more quickly, and there'd be fewer distractions, but it would also involve most likely the US Navy taking various offensive actions a lot quicker, which usually would be good, but in early 1942, as we see at Guadalcanal, the Japanese still have an awful lot of bite to them, so it would be paradoxically possibly slightly worse, in that the US may actually commit to actions sooner than they're necessarily ready for, and then take even higher losses in 1942, which might actually put them in a position where they are actually crippled and unable to operate for a few months in late 42, early 43, until the various reinforcements can get there. It's one of those weird counterfactuals where, by making things run quicker and more smoothly, you could actually potentially make the situation worse. Theoretically, the best possible outcome in that situation is for something to happen to MacArthur in early 1943, just when the US Navy is catching its second wind, and then can really use the advantage if it's able to coordinate things a bit better. Robert Pavlchek asks, regarding episode 198's question about hypothetical US Navy battle cruisers in the Washington Naval Treaty, would the existence of Lexington diminutives have allowed an accelerated development time for the Alaska class? And what other effects on the Alaskas and other ships might Lexington diminutives have had? Probably not a tremendous amount of effect, to be perfectly honest, because Lexington diminutive battle cruisers, one, are still going to be a lot larger than the Alaskas, and two, they are going to be capital ships. And as I discussed in the video on the Alaskas are very much grown-up versions of cruisers. So the fact that you have a true battle cruiser in the form of a 35,000-ton diminutive Lexington doesn't actually change all that much for the development of the Alaskas. If any, I mean, the problem is at that point, it's because it's a hypothetical building on a hypothetical, you can actually make arguments either way. You could make an argument that because they now have experience of operating this kind of cruiser killing vessel, that may pave the way for the US Navy to be more favourable, to the development of the Alaska class, which might accelerate things. Conversely, the fact that they exist might cause the US Navy to go, we already have these, why do we need new ones, which might actually put the Alaska class further back on the back burner. So, yeah, this is that. I think it's an interesting question to consider, but it has a very, very open-ended set of realistic answers. Johannes Fountain Mika says the Gobin situation was more of a problem with no museum having the money and dock space to host her. Yeah, but the Prince Eugen's not exactly that much smaller. Richard Goss asks, if Royal Navy Yards are currently modernising the QE's renown and building new warships, then an MP fresh from a visit to Italy has seen the modernised Cavours. He argues for and gets funding for a couple of R's to go over to Italy. Knowing what you do about Italian rebuilds, what do you think they can do with an R? Also, let's say the war breaks out before the second R is complete. Do the Italians have the ability to use and supply her? Do the Italians have the ability to use and supply an R-class battleship they've Cavoured? I think it depends on what they've done. If they've done things to British spec, no, because the British are working Imperial, the Italians are working metric, which is just, it's basically going to be the same kind of problem they had with Richelieu, except on a much larger scale and with a smaller industrial base. If, however, they've done things like replace, when they're doing the machinery replacements, replaced it with Italian machinery, if they have rebought the guns to an Italian caliber, etc., etc., then obviously they are in a much better position to make use of the ship. But if somehow this MP has convinced everybody to send a couple of R's to Italy to get Cavoured, and Italy has somehow agreed, and everybody's not seen what horrible idea this is, I mean, the R-class, technically speaking, are a better foundation to work with than the Cavours, with the only caveat that unlike the Cavours, they don't have a fifth turret to lose to free up weight, but they do have the machinery originally for 23 knots. So they're originally they're already 2 knots faster than the baseline Cavours, so it won't require as much new machinery to get them up to 27, 28 knots. So you might get away with building building an extra bow onto them, completely replacing the machinery like for like with new. Then you might get a fast R out of it, reasonably enough. It'd be interesting actually to see exactly what the balance is of, if you Cavour an R, do you have to turn it into basically a slightly weird looking renown, i.e. take out one of the main battery turrets to get it up to 28 plus knots, or can you actually do that, given that you're starting at 23 knots original design speed, when as compared to the 21 knots for the Cavours? But yeah, realistically, Italy had been in Britain's bad books for a very long time before World War II broke out. Albert Bear, which 2 episodes are you referring to? Because the last 2 episodes have been Neptune and US Shipbuilding Part 2, which are 2 very different episodes. Daniel Silverthorne, on the night of the 7th of May 1942, if the Japanese and American carriers had only been 30 miles apart, as was estimated by the radar operators aboard Lexington, according to Ian Toll in Pacific Crucible, how might this have played out for a night action, or even the following morning, if the carriers had been at one another's horizons at dawn? Would the twin 8-inch guns of Lexington finally have been useful as anything other than top weight and a showpiece? And which side might actually have been successful in a close-range daytime surface action between the carriers and their escorts? I actually think the Japanese might have had a bit of an advantage there. Let me just check the orders of battle. So the Japanese, they've got Shikaku, Zuikaku, a couple of Miyokos, a couple of Fubukis, some other destroyers. Their invasion forces are off doing their own thing, so we don't really need to worry about those so much. The Allies have Yorktown and Lexington with 4 Sims class. They've got 5 heavy destroyers with 5 heavy cruisers with 5 more destroyers. Okay, so yeah, that's going to be interesting, because actually at that point the Japanese are outgunned. There are more destroyers and cruisers available to the US Navy than there are to the Japanese. The flip side is the Japanese have long lances, and at this point the Americans have no experience of them. Yeah, sure. If they're on the horizon, you might as well use Lexington's 8-inch guns. But if they're fighting in close action to try and protect or just their own carriers and destroy the others, I think it would come down to how effective the Japanese long lance spreads are, because again, the people aren't going to be expecting them, the long range long lance strikes. So if they can reap an early heavy toll, then the Japanese have a significant advantage. Otherwise, in a daylight action, the Americans have significantly more vessels. So, well, I think you just yeah, it would be a flip of I think it would be a flip of the dice based on what happens with that torpedo salvo. Albert Bear. Oh, okay. So the 2 graph episodes, the shipbuilding episodes. Well, people asked me to do them, so I did. So don't worry, I'm not going to become Drac does XL the channel. There might be one more. I might at some point do one more as a comparison episode, but it won't be for a while, because trust me, that many lines in XL is not fun to process. Frank Spazzato saying Lexington didn't have her 8-inch at the Battle of Coral Sea. Well, I'm just taking it off of the question, assuming that the question is reporting things accurately. Was Lexington? That's like an interesting question, actually. Oh yeah, March 42. Lexington's 8-inch gun turrets were removed at Pearl Harbor and replaced with 7 quadruple for 1.1. Okay, well, yeah, at that point she doesn't have her 8-inch. But to be fair, even if she doesn't have her 8-inch, it's pretty much the same question. It's basically the Japanese escorts are outnumbered, but they have long lances, which the Americans are not used to countering. So that's the short version. Thank you very much, Peter Vieden. I think that's how it's pronounced. Jonathan Welch asks, the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Kido Butai and the subsequent battles of 1942 are fought with 6 Taiho-class carriers with the design flaws resolved. How much differently would the war have played out, especially considering the armoured flight decks? I don't think it would actually play out that much differently, for one major reason. And that is that the US Dauntless dive bombers use the 1,000-pound bomb. The Taiho's flight decks can reject 500-pounders all day. No problem. They're not designed to reject 1,000-pounders. Now, granted, as when the Germans dropped 1,000-pounders on Illustrious and so forth, the armoured flight decks would help. You're not going to get deep penetration hits with the 1,000-pounders if the armoured flight deck is in place. But given the circumstances if we replicate the circumstances of, say, the Japanese carriers at Midway, that bomb's still going off in the hangar deck. Which point the carriers are still basically doomed. if you wanted to have the tie hose make a significant difference, you would have to have the tie hose and also have resolved several issues with how the Japanese handled their aircraft, and how vulnerable some of their other systems were. If you resolve those, so then you have bombs exploding high up in the ship but not necessarily doing fatal damage because, hangars full of aircraft aren't exploding, then, I mean, the Americans are still going to win, but the war might play out considerably longer, because at that point then you might have a number of tie-hos which take hits and are badly damaged but able to withdraw and therefore able to come back again, as opposed to historically when you have things like a cargo just burning to the ground or to the waterline. USS Grey Ghost. Now, the Dauntlesses carried a mixture of bombs. The Scout Dauntlesses carried the lighter bombs, but the attack Dauntlesses were carrying 1,000-pounders basically from the start. Even older things like the original model biplane Helldiver was theoretically capable of carrying 1,000-pounders. So we have 6 more Patreon questions left, then the super chats that have come in, and then we're on to the chat. And we're not actually doing too badly. It's only 10 past 10. Dr. DM Platt, what effect might a time-walked Admiral Ching Li have had if he'd had replaced BT with the battle cruisers 3 months before Dogger Bank? Or 3 months before Jutland, especially if you had full knowledge of the events which actually transpired in the original actual timeline. Now, that would be a thing to behold. Admiral Lee, possibly one of the most qualified gun admirals in history, and he's given charge of the British battlecruiser fleet, either 3 months before Dogger Bank or before Jutland. Yeah, there are going to be some changes. If he has full knowledge of the events that transpired, the first thing he's going to be doing is marching up and down from, magazine and shell room all the way up to the gun house via the handling rooms. And he is going to make sure that those things are spick and span, that every single safety system is in place. And then he's going to make absolutely certain that his crews get plenty of gun practice to get them as accurate as possible. Especially if he knows what's going to happen to them otherwise. At which point, then the British can actually exploit some of the inherent advantages they have in their battle cruisers. Because remember, one of the bigger problems that the British had... with making use of the... Sorry, just getting rid of another few bots. One of the biggest problems the British had was that, technically speaking, the Splendid Cat, so Lion, Queen Mary, Princess Royal, and eventually Tiger, their guns could shoot considerably further than the German guns could, both in part because of the larger caliber and in part because they could elevate further. And this was one of the things that was made a big deal of pre-war and even at the beginning of the war. And as Gregor's point, even with the relatively terrible British fuses, the fact is, if the British battlecruisers estimate the range correctly, and if their crews have been trained by Admiral Lee to be able to shoot very accurately, they can start hitting the German battlecruisers very far out, beyond the German battlecruisers' ability to physically reply. And even if the range eventually closes down, but battlecruisers that have taken hits that might have knocked out fire control systems, disabled turrets, set fires, etc., are at a significant disadvantage compared to ships that aren't. And, again, given if he has full knowledge, which would include, in theory, a knowledge that the fuses were faulty, he might also just turn around and say, use the CPC shells. Don't bother with the AP shells, use the CPC shells, at which point you're getting basically the same, near enough, not exactly the same, but you're getting close to the same armour penetration. And with the dodgy fuses, it's probably not going to make much odds, but you're getting a lot bigger bang occurring when it hits vulnerable portions of the ship. So yeah, I definitely would not want to be in the Germans' shoes if the battle cruiser fleet's tootling along, having been whipped into shape in terms of its gunnery by Admiral Lee. Frosius asks, alternate history, what do you think would be the ideal pirate ship in the era of steam and steel to get the big ships in the middle of the ocean? I think you go two ways on this. One, the ideal pirate ship could be a schooner of some description, something like SMS Adler. Not because it's particularly large and powerful, but because it can blend in. Because remember, this was half the thing about a lot of pirate ships, the fact they could just pretend to be merchant ships. So that would work, because you can go out, it's fast enough to catch enemy ships. You've probably still got a reasonable argument for them ship to be armed, but it can go out, take on its targets, and then it can just pretend to be a standard merchantman. If, on the other hand, you want to go, full bore, and I'm going to take on any small warships that come looking for me, that's a slightly different matter. At which point you probably want, in the age of steam and steel, basically something the local timeline equivalent to Warrior, something fast, heavily armed, heavily armoured, what they would have termed a first-class protected cruiser. But at that point, you're having to fight a lot more battles because you're recognisably a warship. So actually, if you're going to do piracy, the objective of which is to steal everything and get really rich and do the minimum amount of fighting, a Adler type schooner is probably your best bet. You got the range, you got the distance, you got the armament, and you got the camouflage. Salty Viking 10,022. You're sent back to the 1938 US Navy with all your current knowledge. You have to prepare the US Navy for World War II without letting anyone already know that you already know what's coming. What do you do and why? Well, it depends what position I'm in, doesn't it? I mean, if I'm sent back as me, they're probably not going to listen to just a random half South American Brit who shows up and starts telling them that half of their stuff isn't going to work properly. If I've been teleported back into a position where they are actually going to listen to me, one of the first things I'm going to do is find some funding from somewhere and conduct some full-scale tests on Mark 14 torpedoes, even if the Bureau of Ordnance screams and stamps their feet, and show that it doesn't actually work properly and force them to fix it before the war starts. I mean, to be honest, it's in terms of, because that's not letting on that I know what's coming. That's just me being particularly picky about, on paper, it's me being particularly picky about making sure there's a practical test going. The other thing I would probably do is arrange for some anti-aircraft exercises using the Quad 1.1s. And then watch and see how often they jam and break, and then offer competitive submissions from various other manufacturers, and see if I can somehow persuade everyone to start buying in on the Oerlikons and the Bofors earlier in time. Now, of course, the Bofors especially will have to be stripped down, reworked, and turned into something that can be mass-produced, but starting that process earlier is better. Plus, if I find 1938 Admiral Lee and let him play with very early prototype radars, I'm fairly sure I can get radar deployed a little bit earlier. But those are the things I can do that will prepare everyone without letting everyone know that war is coming, because I can plausibly come up with other reasons as to why I would be doing that. Whereas if I turn around and suddenly say, we should really start thinking about investing in convoy systems, yeah, that's a lot more of a giveaway. Alec Ruby asks, in 1903, both the Wright brothers die in an accident so horrific that inventors around the world had give up on trying to develop heavier than air flight for about 15 years. All other technological advancements that would normally happen when they did, and maybe even faster due to the increased focus its air powers invested in so heavily. How does this change naval warfare and tactics, and how do you think it affects global politics? Does World War I and II still happen when they do, or do they happen later, or is there just one large war happening in place? I don't think the lack of aircraft makes any difference to the start of World War I. The early initial scouting roles by fighters would probably be taken up first by tethered balloons and later various sizes and shapes of blimps and airships, which would be slightly, in some ways, slightly easier targets for anti-aircraft guns. In other ways, perhaps not. If they, if they're going after if they invent some very high flying ones, like the way the Germans did later in the war. But yeah, fundamentally, it's not going to stop the outbreak of World War I, or really how it went. There are other substitutes for heavier than air aircraft in that early period. And whilst there were occasional sort of little flashes of things like the raids on the Zeppelin sheds or the first torpedo bomber attack and so forth, aircraft by and large don't have a huge role to play in how World War I shapes out. And if everybody tries with heavier than air flight in sort of starting 1918, there's more than enough time for carriers to eventually develop. Admittedly, it might be a little bit behind our historical curve, but yeah, World War II, there will be carriers, there will still be doctrines, so there might be a generation or two stepped back from things, but it's not going to make a huge amount of difference. I mean, the Swordfish would be perfectly at home in a carrier war that stepped back 5 or 10 years. Possibly Pearl Harbor might be somewhat less effective, but then again, more aircraft might be involved because they'd be smaller, so who knows. Introvert asks, Admiral Halsey is relieved of command after the Typhoon Cobra incident. Who do you think replaces him, and do you see any real impact on the prosecution of the war as a result? That late in the war, I don't think it's going to make too much odds. And Halsey was already swapping command back and forth. That's why it's 57 or 37, depending on who's in command. So, the direct replacement is just going to be it's going to be the same as well, actually, then that's the other point. Who takes over at that time? Now that's interesting. I'm just going to check. Because you've got the fast carrier task groups. Yeah, so it'd just be a basic takeover. Task Force, that's at 38. Sorry, 37 was the British. Yeah, so Task Force 38 and 58. So you've got Spruance and Halsey. So basically just Spruance would get stuck with command for a longer period of time towards the end of the war. But it's your basic. It's at that point, it's not going to change the outcome of the war all that much, except for the fact you probably won't run into a second typhoon. Sean Riley, we've got one more Patreon question to go, and then the super chats, and then we're on to everybody else. Class A Cornate, being the last Patreon chat, last but one, sorry, I missed one, says, suppose the Japanese get their decisive battle in January 43 between the battleships. What is the rough order of battle that both sides have available? The Japanese have Yamato and Musashi, but they're down a couple of Congos. Has Mutsu exploded by that point? Possibly. They've definitely got Nagato still around. January 43, so Mutsu's still around. So they've got Mutsu, Nagato, Fuso Issei, Yamashiro, and Hyuga. 2 Congos. So basically it's their pre-war battle line, except they've swapped out 2 Congos for 2 Yamatos, which is, you know, quite a impressive battle line. The US Navy has, well, it's got, in terms of fast ships, they've got the North Carolinas, albeit they're still experiencing some issues. The South Dakotas are all in service, so that's going to help. So they've got 6 fast battleships. And then the Iowas, I don't think any of the Iowas are around in January 43. No. Okay, so it's just, so you've got the South Dakotas, you've got the Iowas, and then you've got a grab bag of various standard class. So the US battle line is going to be slightly larger. It's going to have more modern fast capital ships, although you do have the Yamatos in play. But considering that if you want to split things down, you can put 2 South Dakotas and a North Carolina up against each Yamato. I can't see the Yamatos winning that fight. And then you've got a mixture of World War I ships facing off against each other. So I think basically, in some ways, it would come down similar to the alternate Samar that I did at one point, where you'd have a potential back and forth either way between what's left of the US standards, because obviously a bunch of them got taken out and still would be down from Pearl Harbor, but the Japanese also have older vessels and maybe slightly outnumbered there. And then it's just a case of, okay, when do the surviving and still vaguely intact US fast battleships show up and start chewing through what's left of the Japanese older battle line. Tim Schoenberger saying South Dakota's under repair. Yeah, I know. I'm just talking about overall, these are the ships that physically exist. Obviously, the Japanese are going to have ships under repair, under refit. They're not going to be able to bring every single ship to the field, and neither's the US, but in broad outlines, that's kind of the situation. Right, so Michelle is the one that I apparently missed. So the question is, what's the biggest switcheroo within the Channel period? The rules are the same name, same navy, same class, same primary construction material. So, for example, swapping the USS Iowa BB4 for USS Iowa BB61. How does this influence both timelines? So basically, what are the biggest cases where you switch 2 ships that have the same name? And they have to be, so you can't swap a wooden ship with a steel ship. I mean, swapping, what do you think? No, not Maine. I mean, yeah, swapping our USS Iowa for BB61 for BB4 would be quite a big effect, because that would mean you'd have an Iowa class battleship, like the fast one, available for the Spanish-American War, which would make it even more one-sided than normal. You could also swap HMS Vanguard, the last battleship, with HMS Vanguard, the St. Vincent class, which would put a fully radar-equipped 15-inch gun battleship in the British battle line for Jutland, which would make a huge difference for obvious, rather obvious reasons, one would suspect. Switching Scharnhorst and Organizer now from their World War II iterations over to becoming Admiral von Spey's flagships shortly before the Battle of the Falkland Islands would have a rather explosive change on the timelines as well. The flip side is, of course, going back the other way, I mean, swapping Vanguard or Iowa for their pre-Dreadnought or early Dreadnought counterparts, the reverse swap probably doesn't make too much odds. In the Iowa's case, the US has more than enough fast battleships coming online. In the British case, Vanguard's only completed after the war, so they'd be slightly confused, but it doesn't change all that much. And then, yeah, as for the rest, yeah, there would be the Scharnhorst would have a bit more of an effect, because whilst obviously the Scharnhorst becoming Admiral von Spee's two big ships would have a huge effect in World War One, robbing the Germans of their only two fast capital ships for the start of World War II could see them lose the Norway campaign, because if Scharnhorst and Gneisenau are now a pair of old armoured cruisers, well, they're not going to be facing off against Renown at Lofoten anytime soon, so Renown gets to go off and do interesting things, and they're not going to be catching Glorious, so the British have an extra carrier. Whether the Germans would even feel safe in launching the Norway campaign without the cover of at least some kind of fast capital ship would be a big question as well. Captain Seaforth pointing out the illustrious class aircraft carrier for the Majestic class battleship of the same name. Yeah, I mean, that would have a big effect as well. And Renown for Renown, her World War II renown for the second class battleship. Although in both of those cases, obviously sticking them in for replacement as late as humanly possible in the run up to World War I is better, to avoid the ships being run down in the interim. Right, sorry, I know it's only 10:30, but I am fading a little bit, with it having been a long and stressful day. So I do apologise if I seem to wander off on slight tangents, but it's not intentional. Right. It's also really warm and muggy. Deep Blue Dreams, super chat question. If you could build a pair of ships Yamato style for each naval power, i.e. very secret and very big, what would they look like, discounting materials, costs, etc.? Well, for the US, it's fairly easy. It's the Montanas. For the French, it's probably going to be the four quad turret Alsace. The Italians are harder to answer because there's a variety of potential options out there. And they didn't really have concrete designs for some really, really big stuff. They had some fairly decent iterative follow-ons, but, you know, the French ideas for iterative follow-ons were literally just add extra quad turrets. So you could even make an argument for a 4 quad turret ship if you want to go Yamato size. The Montanas are obviously for the US. For the British, I mean, the British would probably need a Montana equivalent, i.e. a stretched Lion with 12, 16-inch guns. The Germans would be building like H-39 or H-41. Yeah, and then it just the Italians, trying to figure out what the Italians would do. Would they do a 16-inch Littorio? Would they do a quad 16-inch or a quad 15-inch Littorio? But yeah, those would be my options. Hendog 1000. Bismarck and Tirpitz are never built, and instead 2 Scharnhorst are finished with 15-inch guns as intended, and these are sent on Operation Rheinebung with Prince Eugen and Hipper. Does this change how the UK reacts? Yes, very definitely. Because I mean, effectively, you've doubled up the force. Because yes, okay, a Scharnhorst with 6 15-inch guns is technically not quite as capable as a Bismarck with 8 15-inch guns, but for all intents and purposes, they're fast, well-protected 15-inch gun battleships, fast battleships. Now there's 2 of them, each with a cruiser escort, as opposed to just Bismarck, which goes out historically. At which point, I don't think Tovey is sending Hood and Prince of Wales out on their own. It's going to be time for sending out basically the entire home fleet. So it would be Prince of Wales, King George V, and Hood, plus Victorious, regardless of the fact that Prince of Wales and Victorious are somewhat new. It would basically be an entire home fleet sailing, and to be honest, there'd be more ships with the home fleet. There might be one of the other battle cruisers kept with the home fleet as well. So it would be a full home fleet versus German ships assault, which would be a very interesting fight to look at. But yeah, at the same time, the 2 Scharnhorst might just decide, you know what, we actually still have a speed advantage. We're just going to motor. The Stoned Abbot asks, have you ever considered going on the Well, There's Your Problem podcast? It's about engineering disasters. I haven't personally thought about it before. I wouldn't, in principle, necessarily be opposed. I mean, I've heard about them, and I think I recall listening to some of their episodes. It certainly sounds familiar. But yeah, I mean, there's only so many hours in the day, so yeah, I'd have to take a closer look into it. But in principle, I wouldn't have any problem with going and checking them. There's plenty of naval engineering disasters to talk about. Everything from ships falling over to ships sinking on launch to, well, some of the worst ships ever built. Sapper Ninja asks, why did the Royal Navy stop building 8-inch cruisers after the York class, and why were the York class less capable than the Counties? So they stopped building 8-inch cruisers after the Yorks because they'd reached what the treaty limit said they could have in terms of heavy cruisers by the time of the 1930s, and they were concentrating on 6-inch light cruisers because they could be built more numerous, and everyone thought that you could get, well, A, you could get more 6-inch cruisers, and B, everyone thought that at least the bigger 6-inch cruisers like the Towns might be able to take on 8-inch cruisers anyway. And why were the York class less capable than the Counties? Because there was limitations on cruiser tonnage as well as limitations on maximum number of heavy cruisers. So the Royal Navy was trying to, by building diminutives like the Arethuses, the Leanders weren't diminutives, but they were diminutive compared to the Towns. By basically building ships that were under the weight limit, they were hoping to get more ships. And they thought their concern was that they needed more ships, even if the individual ships were slightly less capable, as opposed to fewer, more powerful ships, because fewer ships can only be in so many places at once. Michael McLeod, wow, thank you very much, says, if the 55,000-ton liners Berengaria, Leviathan and Majestic were all still laid up in the UK at the start of World War II, would you scrap them for the steel, or do you think there's other ways they could have contributed? I definitely wouldn't scrap them for the steel. If you've got really big, fast liners, there's 2 things you could use them for. The first, and perhaps more obvious to me, is what they used historically the other big liners, big fast liners like Queen Mary for, which is troop transports. Pack thousands and thousands of troops, set throttles to maximum and go motoring across the Atlantic with a couple of fast escorts and basically watch the U-boats flail in your wake. The other alternative with ships that size might, and I do stress might, have been some idea of carrier conversion, because let's face it, the Japanese converted some liners into aircraft carriers. The Americans were planning on converting a liner or 2 into aircraft carriers, even though it never actually quite came off. So yeah, I would think the first thing you would do would be to bulk up your troop transport capability, and if the addition of all of these ships, means that you actually maybe even have too many big troop transports, then you might look at converting one or more of those liners into carriers. Probably actually not to those. You might actually look at converting some of the others that are less useful, because there's an awful lot of people you can fit on 55,000 tons worth of ship, especially if it's not got guns and armour to worry about. Chazix asks, what if World War II Britain had World War I era dry dock capacity? Well, they could build a lot more ships for a start. You'd hope they had that in addition to their World War II dry dock capacity, because some of the World War II dry docks were obviously considerably larger than their World War I equivalents. So you'd have kind of the World War I stuff that was still there in World War II, the stuff that had been introduced in the interwar period, but then all the stuff that had been shut down in World War I coming back. So at that point, it's far less likely that ships would suffer delays from construction, and they might continue building larger ships, and they'd be able to build more smaller ships as well. Because if they have the dry dock capacity, that also means they have the skilled workforce. If they have many more skilled men, they can continue, rather than having to go, right, we've only got a limited number of slipways and a limited number of skilled men, so we have to prioritize this ship over this ship. Vanguard, for example, being delayed in favor of Implacable. If they don't have that problem, they can go, right, Vanguard gets built at speed, Implacable gets built at speed, maybe we still have a crack at getting Lion and Temeraire out there, and so on and so forth. So yeah, basically there'd be a lot more ships being built and other ships being overhauled and repaired more quickly, which then may lead to other ships being hauled in. Because you're able to produce more ships and maintain more ships, you might also then start hauling in other ships for refit and for full-on refit, because you have more ships and more capacity, so their loss, well, their temporarily loss from the front line is not as noticeable. Maxwell Looney, the year is 1925 and you're sent back to become the head of the US Navy's Bureau of Ordnance. Using your future knowledge, how do you improve the combat capabilities of the US Navy going into World War II? As the head of the Bureau of Ordnance, first thing, obviously, make sure the Mark 14 torpedo works. The one I would be less tempted to fix is the whole issue that caused the Iowas to have the guns that they did, because of course originally the Iowas were supposed to have the same armament as the South Dakotas. Then they were supposed to use the older 16-inch 50s left over from the Lexington and South Dakota 1920s programs, and only finally did they actually end up with the 16-inch 50 Mark 7s, which they historically did, all thanks to various screw-ups between Bureau of Ships and Bureau of Ordnance. Given the actual outcome of that, I'd be tempted to actually just leave that to play out the way that it did while I concentrate on fixing the Mark 14s. What other future knowledge would I use? Well, similar to what I said before, quietly trying to introduce actually reliable, decent anti-aircraft guns to the US Navy pre-war, so that when Admiral King goes on his anti-aircraft gun equipment spree, there's guns available, and they're decent ones. Also, Bureau of Ordnance doesn't have the sway to do things like, change the defences at Pearl Harbor and things like that, so there's not a tremendous amount I can do there, limiting myself purely to the Bureau of Ordnance measures. The other thing I could do actually with future knowledge would be to possibly accelerate the pace of development for the automated turrets. So you might see auto-loading 6-inch and maybe auto-loading 8-inch coming into play in ships that actually get a chance to see action in World War II, which would be hilarious. Trains King asks, I've heard you can't stand vegetables without throwing up. Yeah, basically. What is the reason behind this, and does this feeling apply to fruit as well? It doesn't apply to all fruit, although it does apply to some. And basically, for whatever reason, when I was very, very small, as in before I could even speak, I developed a distinctive aversion to vegetables. And it it may have been down to the fact that a lot of the vegetables I was offered were boiled, but not all of them were. Some of them were prepared in slightly more exciting ways, and others came, pre-packed in baby food and stuff. So I don't think it was a particular texture or way of producing them. It was just the fact that as a 1 and 2 year old baby, I hated vegetables right from the start. I wouldn't eat them, and to the point that you could give me a bowl of standard issue baby food and I would actually just go in, and there are pictures of me doing this, my parents have got, I would go in first with my spoon, and of course a baby spoon's not exactly the best tool for the job, so I'd eventually end up going in with my hands and physically picking out any vegetable I could see or feel before happily eating everything else. And there was absolutely no way on this planet you were going to get me to eat any substantial amount of vegetation. Fruits, apples, bananas, that kind of thing, fine, but not vegetables. And that's basically just been, as a kid, I developed some kind of, subconscious, irrational dislike of them. I maintained that conscious dislike of them throughout my childhood into my teens. And I think by this point, I just haven't eaten vegetables for so long that my body treats them as a foreign substance. It doesn't know how to deal with them. That's the best guess I can come up with. Aluminium fence. Yeah, my doctors absolutely hate me because I'm a walking poster child for everything you shouldn't do. And yeah, okay, I did put on a bit of weight over COVID, which I do need to lose, which I'm not too happy about. But outside of that, you put my blood work through the blood testing and screening and do all the other stuff. I don't have high cholesterol. I don't have indicator signs of pre-onset diabetes or any of the other, or heart disease, or any of the other ridiculous things that supposedly someone like me who exists on a meat, carbs and sugar diet should supposedly have. Literally the only thing that's anomalous about my physicals is I have an elevated iron count in my bloodstream, but given that I'm half Bolivian, that's not exactly shocking. So yeah. A Derp's good. What about the newer plant-based burgers? I tried one of the, I think in Burger King Impossible Burgers. I think those are the ones. I got like halfway through one chew before I vowed never to touch one of those things ever again. There's a certain amount of texture, I think, to it as well. Aluminium pencils, my grandma would whop you until you ate them. Yeah, as a kid, I would literally throw them at people if you tried to make me eat them. Anyway, that was a bit of an interesting diversion. Sherman117 says, what do you think was a more crazy naval manoeuvre? The destroyers charging at Samar or the death ride of the first scouting group at Jutland? To be honest, Samar. I mean, both of them were pretty nuts. But if you sat back and looked at it from a rational perspective at the time, first scouting group did have some. They had armor. And a reasonable person looking at it from an outside perspective could potentially have anticipated the oversaturation of incoming shells, which, didn't help the British in terms of hitting them because there were so many shells coming in, no one could tell whose shells were whose. So there were some kind of... There was some reasoning to suggest that perhaps first scouting group wouldn't lose all its ships going in, whereas every bit of conventional wisdom when the destroyers and destroyer escorts turn around at Samar says that in theory they should have been blown out of the water in 5 minutes flat after accomplishing nothing. And therefore the fact that that didn't happen, at least for a little while, makes them the slightly more crazy ones. Lightning Wing Dragon, can you do a video on all the iterations of the North Carolina class? Basically kind of what could have been. Yeah, sure, at some point. I'll add it to the list. Add it to a very, very long list of things to do. But yeah, there certainly is something that's interesting enough. There's loads of different potential configurations, and a lot of them are very unusual. Texas Analyst Shock says, bouncing off an earlier question, it seems Bismarck, Yamato, Titanic, etc. have a much larger mythos than ships like Enterprise. Does the tragedy aspect come into play here in your mind? Yes, I think so. Yeah. A ship, I mean, it's the same thing as, you know, with various admirals as well, like Nelson, etc. A ship that sinks, or a person who dies in the course of doing something relatively notable, tends to be remembered more, partly because of the tragic aspect of it, and partly because it draws a line under it. There's like, you know, there's always that tentative, what could have been, what might have happened, what else could they have done had X not happened. Whereas with ships like Enterprise, you have those answers. You know, with admirals that survive battles, you have those answers. And so it wears away slightly at a little bit of the mystique, because it's like, if you imagine if Enterprise, after surviving the Guadalcanal campaign, just let's say at some point in 1943 had just taken a really bad hit and exploded or burned, people would be asking, oh, you know, all the Yorktown class were gone by mid-1943. What could the US Navy have done with a Yorktown class carrier in 44 and 45? Could it have been used for specialist roles? Would it still have been a practical frontline combatant? People would be asking all these things, and that would add to the mythos of the Enterprise, whereas Enterprise was around in 44, 45, and we know exactly what the answers to those questions were. Those answers are usually fairly cool, but they're known, and therefore there's a little bit less mystery surrounding them. Noza Man asks, how effective do you think the Scharnhorsts and Gneisenauers would have been if Germany had saved the design of the 35cm gun from the Mackensons and armed them with 9 of those instead of the A11-inch? Well, it's kind of a halfway house towards being on with the 15s. That would have made them quite interesting. I mean, on the one hand, you're still pushing it to get through the armour of the bigger, more modern ships and full-on battleships, but it would give them especially combined, a significantly greater edge against taking on things like Renown, and it would make them just generally a little bit more lethal, somewhat larger as well. It would have been interesting to see what the French did in response, because of course they built Dunkirk as a response to the Deutschlands. They were building Strasbourg to the same spec. Then the Scharnhorst came along, and the French were relatively happy with the firepower. They just up-armoured Strasbourg. But if the Scharnhorst are coming out with these much heavier guns, well, they'll probably still up-armour Strasbourg because it's right there, ready to go, almost ready to go. But it would have been interesting. I think it might have triggered a second French response. Tyler Kuhn asks, if the French Admiralty rejected the Jeune École and continued a traditional battle fleet, how would this affect their naval strength and infrastructure? Well, they would have had a continuous battleship design lineage going, which would have probably obviated some of the issues that their pre-dreadnoughts had. The infrastructure one is interesting, though, because, as I said before, a lot of the French infrastructure was just too small. If they'd continued battleship building efforts through the period where historically they had the Jeune École, that might have led to infrastructure upgrades with substantially larger shipyards being built. But considering this is post-Franco-Prussian War, it might also have had a curtailment effect, in as much as the French government might have said, well, these are the shipyards we've got, build your ships to those specs, and once they've got an idea that they can do that, it might have been harder and harder progressively to persuade the French government to upgrade the infrastructure, whereas conversely, by the time they start building full pre-dreadnoughts again, there is a bit more of an argument to start upgrading French infrastructure because everybody else has moved on in such a sort of distinctive way. So yeah, they keep their battleship strength up, because basically the adoption of the Je ne Col is kind of, in a lot of ways, is kind of, that's where the French give up being the second largest navy by a considerable margin on the planet, and they start entering a realm of several other vaguely peer navies. So yeah, they'd probably maintain their lead for considerably longer as the second navy on the planet. Colin Cameron, if the rebellion loses in 1775, so America stays part of the empire and is forced to end slavery in 1833, so the Royal Navy is not able to employ runaway slaves, how does this affect Royal Navy manning levels -- ethnic makeup? That's a good question. I mean, the second order effects of if 13 colonies and subsequent expansions stay part of the empire are so huge, the empire almost certainly doesn't resemble anything like what the historical one did. The thing is, yeah, Royal Navy manning levels, if they've got access to the American, the full North American continent, including the 13 colonies and, again, any expansions thereof, they can probably substitute the manning levels quite easily from these new populations. The ethnic makeup, there were a fairly surprising number of people from all over the world in the Royal Navy even prior to 1833. And it's not just escaped slaves. The Royal Navy would literally take on practically anybody as long as you knew how to sail a ship. So, yeah, I mean, the escaped slave demographic would be considerably less, but I suspect that would just be, in a lot of ways, be made up or from other populations that possibly hit the historic US stateside population, possibly just escaped slaves or other recruits from other areas. See you later, Rebel Squirrel. Galdar Ioni, the Japanese get the blueprints for the VT fuse and possibly some test samples in 42. Can they get it or a countermeasure to it into service in time? A countermeasure might be possible. I don't think the Japanese would be able to replicate the VT fuse in good time. They would be able to eventually, but getting it done in time and in large enough numbers to make a difference, probably not going to happen. Also coupled with the fact that the Japanese dual-purpose 5-inch gun is a far cry from the 5-inch 38 in effectiveness. Countermeasures would be slightly easier to do, because if they've got the blueprints and some test samples, they can work out what frequency the VT fuse operates on, or which frequencies, and just start blanketing them with jamming to try at least to make the VT fuses blow up before they get close to the planes. Arthur Brogan asks, how about favourite sea movies for all ages? Well, I think I've done this on a few Drydocks before. Master and Commander's obviously up there. There's a lot of movies. It depends what you want to watch. I wouldn't watch Pearl Harbor again. Definitely not going to watch. Yeah, what's the name? I need to see Greyhound at some point. I've got Apple TV now, so I probably should do that. See, a lot of my exposure is series, like the Hornblower series, as opposed to movies. Titanic is fun if you want to laugh at the screen. Yeah, to be honest, I think if someone just cornered me and said, right, recommend a bunch of Naval Sea movies, my brain kind of shuts off after Master and Commander. I like personally, the Pirates of the Caribbean movies that I've seen. I've seen 1 to 3. I vaguely recall seeing 4 at some point. Das Boot, yeah, people keep arguing whether Das Boot is a series or a film. I mean, I'm technically of the opinion that yes, it can count as a film, but it is also a series. So, oh yeah, Hunt for Red October, where you've got Sean Connery playing Sean Connery, pretending to be the world's most Scottish Russian. Yeah, the thing is, I haven't actually seen too many naval movies. I just haven't had the time, apart from anything else, to be honest. So yeah, sorry, I'm drawing up a bit short, but there's a lot of naval movies I haven't had the chance to actually sit through. I was forced to sit through Crimson Tide at school. I can't say I was terribly impressed, but there you go. Spudsky asks, are you a subscriber of the quarterly publication Warship International? Yes, and Warship as well. Sam Reynolds, are you familiar with any more recent naval engagements that are outside of the scope of the channel? Yeah, to varying degrees. Relatively familiar with what went on in the Falklands, thanks to talking to a bunch of Falklands War veterans. But yeah, once you get past 1950, which naval battles are which and what happened and what was the most effective, familiarity is a little bit all over the shop. Michael McCoy, oh yeah, Battleship. Battleship's one of those ones that's just so silly it's funny. I don't even necessarily count it as a naval movie. It's a high fantasy movie involving boats. In some ways, bizarrely enough, certain elements of Pirates of the Caribbean are slightly more realistic than Battleship, although Battleship does have its rather nice moments as well. Sage of Irrelevance, what is the best fleet you could build using copies of one-offs? Sloops, subs, destroyers, heavy and light cruisers, battleships, escorts, and fleet carriers. Escort and fleet carriers. Well, it's a little bit difficult, because when you get to sloops and subs and destroyers, I mean, it depends on the time period. Yeah, you can find one-off examples in the First World War, but if you're looking at the Second World War for one-off examples of those, it can be difficult to find. I mean, sure, you've got things like Wichita and Algerie for the heavy cruiser categories, and there's a handful of solo light cruisers, not many though. I mean, even battleships tend to come in at least pairs. Hood is kind of an exception to that, but the general rule holds true. Escort carriers definitely don't come alone unless you're USS Long Island. And fleet carriers, again, it's like Taiho, Ark Royal, and everything else tends to come in batches. I'm going to keep that question and have a deeper look into it, see how many such things I can actually hunt down. But yeah, that's actually a fairly good question, in as much as it's quite difficult to think of not just one-offs, but really good one-offs. People are obviously pointing out Vanguard is a good one-off battleship, true. Albeit not necessarily planned as such. And the problem is, if you start pinging back and forth across timelines, it becomes less relevant, because you have, fine, Olympia is a one-off cruiser, but with the best one in the world, building a bunch of Olympias when your fleet is mostly World War II timeline based, and you're maybe putting Vanguards out as your battleships, it's not going to end very well. Mike Lima 777, would a modified Abdiel class have made a good destroyer leader given their speed and destroyer grade main armament? Yeah, probably. They've got the speed, they've got the agility. They probably could have had a fairly hefty chunk of weaponry on them if you'd taken all the mines off. Would have been pretty expensive, but if you put twin 4-inch dual purpose on them, they would have made very interesting little ships. Probably most analogous to the Arethusa class of the First World War. Big destroyer flotilla leaders with excessively heavy armament. In some ways, even possibly a small but even faster variant on the ideas propagated by the Atlantas. And we've got so far 6 super chats left. Jeffrey Papier says, the US rearms all the standards with twin 16s, the old 14s, and their ammo sold to Germany and Italy in return for foreign torpedoes. They end up on the Scharnhorst and the Italian rebuilds. How does World War II change? It's probably don't know. Having twin 16s on all the US standards doesn't really change anything, because basically the only time they see surface-to-surface action is Surigao Strait. At which point, whether they have triple 14s or twin 16s doesn't really make too much odds. And if you're a Japanese soldier, if you're being hit by a 14-inch or a 16-inch shell, you probably don't care too much. On the flip side, 15 old 40 triple 14s on the Scharnhorst and the Italian ships does make a huge difference. Triple 14s on the Scharnhorsts, 9 14-inch guns, they are now fully creditable fast battleships instead of small fast or light fast battleships. Flip side, although, from that is that triple 14s are going to weigh an awful lot more than triple 11s. So are they actually as fast as they were before, and how are you fitting them on there? The same goes for the Italian ships, because they've originally got triples and twins of 12-inch. Where are they finding the space to stick on triple 14s? They're going to have to do some rather radical reworking, and they can't even do the traditional, 2 inches in caliber up, take off one gun, because that'll give them twin and singles. The Scharnhorst at least could maybe make an argument for having twin 14s, which make them slightly less capable than having triple 14s, but could be done. Well, yeah, with the Italians, they'd be really in trouble trying to figure out how to squeeze 14-inch guns into old 12-inch turrets. Corn Pop's Revenge asking, have you ever thought about analysing the USS Liberty attack, damage control enacted by the crew, and a breakdown of ship construction? No, I haven't, because it's post-1950, and I'm not touching that with a 10-foot barge pole. Certainly not on this channel. Plus, to be perfectly honest, thanks to modern politics, any discussion of anything involving the USS Liberty and all of that is just going to descend into people wrangling and yelling at each other and trying to rewrite the last however many thousands of years of everybody killing everybody else in the Middle East that we've had. And I'm just not interested in watching that happen for the 16 billionth time. Vintage Car History says, I hope you don't mind, but for the silliness of my next ye old garage, I plan on showing the Gascogne song. Yeah, fine, absolutely. I do apologise for not having got that set to music video. I do plan on doing that at some point in the future. I just, sourcing the footage of Gascogne, being that it basically only exists as sketch plans and in World of Warships, has been somewhat harder than anticipated, and, well, you're probably fairly well aware, more so than most people, of the absolute hectic spiral that my life has been for the past 6 to 9 months. Yeah. Right. Wow, I am properly tired. Things are getting a bit blurry. Alright, let's try and forge on through. JL, if you had the power to freely swap hulls between the fleets of the Royal Navy and the US Navy for World War II, what kind of picks would you prefer to build your ideal fleet for both the Atlantic and Pacific theatres? That's a difficult one, to be honest, because I mean, if I could just swap hulls on a classification basis, then obviously taking Fletchers instead of the wartime emergency flotillas, if I could take them on a one-for-one basis, is obviously better. The Fletchers are bigger and more heavily armed, and certainly more capable in anti-aircraft roles than the wartime emergency flotillas. But if I have the blueprints for the Fletcher hulls, the kind of the downside to that is that realistically I can't actually build them in half the shipyards they built the wartime emergency flotillas in. So it depends on how much of a notional swap as opposed to a nitty-gritty realistic swap we're talking about. And then you have things like, yeah, I'd love to see some Royal Navy Baltimore class, but the Royal Navy wasn't building heavy cruisers during World War II. You see, and it goes on like this. Light cruisers, they're building the Crown colonies. Could you get Cleveland instead? Maybe. Would they be better? Yeah, certainly better than the 3-turret Crown colonies. But it's a marginal improvement compared to some of the other things like having Fletchers instead of wartime emergency ships. And other things like escort, like frigate, destroyer escort, and escort carrier production, they're all shared anyway. The British battleship building efforts end at the King George V's. Would I like to see a Lion armed with 16-inch 50s? Sure, but the British weren't building Lions. Yeah, it is a little bit of a difficult one, to be honest. Because as I say, the ones we're sharing would have been the most important were shared. The ones we're sharing would have been the most fun. The British weren't building ships of that type period during World War II. To be honest, it would have been more about sharing of systems, and if it was down to sharing of systems, given that the British weren't, they weren't going to take my suggestion, obviously, of just doing everything in 4.5s, then the other option, if you're not going to do everything in 4.5s, then anything that isn't done in 4.5 should at least be done in, buy over the American 5-inch 38. Destroyer main armament, cruiser secondaries, battleship and secondaries. The carrier secondaries are already 4.5s, but yeah, you see what I mean. Samperius says, oh, thank you very much. I always get excited about seeing you putting out a new video. Well, that's good. Thank you. Question time. The Swedish Navy celebrates 500 years this year. Can you do a video about the highlights of each century? Oh, each century of the Swedish Navy highlight video. Can give it a shot. I can give it a shot. I'd probably want to work with a Swedish historian to make sure I'm getting all of the facts right on some periods. If you can put me in contact with one, then I'll certainly give it a go. But yeah, so, I mean, it sounds like it sounds like certainly a feasible idea, but I would want to work with someone on it just to make sure that everything is 100%. Rambling Canuck, as a Canadian, I've always been proud of what the Canadian Navy did in World War II, but when talking with my friends in the US, I'm told we did nothing major. Am I right to be proud of our boys and girls? Very definitely. Yeah, sure, Canada wasn't rolling around with battleships and aircraft carriers left, right and centre fighting in the Pacific, which may be what they mean by major. But you can ask anybody who served on or in the Battle of the Atlantic, were the Canadians useful at all in the Caribbean, the Atlantic, the South Atlantic, later in the Pacific, parts of the Mediterranean and the North Sea? Oh, yeah. The Canadian Navy made a huge contribution, mostly to the anti-submarine warfare and convoy escort effort, but also just generally, because for every Canadian escort that's out there is a Royal Navy vessel or a US Navy vessel that's off doing something else. So yeah, sure, Canada's not storming around with the fleet of Essex class, but if the convoys were being savaged because the Canadian Navy didn't exist, then how many Fletchers and various other destroyers would have to have been pulled off to do that escort role instead, and how would that have affected everybody else's offensive roles? The Canadian Navy definitely made a well above its punching weight contribution to the Second World War. It's just that it did it in the Battle of the Atlantic, which in common mythology is just about U-boats. Everyone ignores what ended up killing most of the U-boats. Samperius asks, name your 5 favourite ironclads and why. I mean, Warrior, because she's still around and she started it all. I believe it's the Magenta. Yes, the French ironclad Magenta, because it's the only 2-decker ironclad, which is looks absolutely brilliant. If we're sticking in the era of pure ironclads as opposed to getting into compound armor and all of that stuff, then Bellerophon, just for basically being a gigantic bow wave that happens to have a ship behind it. I'm not sure if it actually counts as an ironclad. Let me just check. I know it was a US... Oh no, sadly it was not an ironclad. Otherwise it... the Black Hawk. Tinclad, but not an ironclad. Other two, so I've got 2 more to choose. Two more favourite ironclads. If I'm going to stick with the bigger ocean-going ones... See, a lot of the stuff that's coming to mind, I'm then going, no, hang on, that's got compound armor or early steel armor, so that doesn't count. Oh, the Royal Oak conversion. That's funny because it's a multi-turreted wooden ironclad conversion. It's quite the amusing little engineering feat. What else would you pick? Let me just check if it's got compound or not. No, it does not have. It doesn't appear to have compound armor. Therefore, my last pick would be the Italia, because it's just funny. Most of my ironclad picks basically rely on, do they look cool or are they hilarious looking? Grey Ghost, what's a Tinclad? Basically, it has a degree of metal armor protection, but it's basically effectively splinter proof only. Oh, of course, Huascar, the little ironclad that could. It's so tiny and cute. Jesse Estrada asks, during I think that's during the time of the US as colonies, were any of the shipyards considered as good as the naval yards in the UK? That's a very large question, because naval yards in the UK. It could be private yards or Royal Dockyards, and they varied quite considerably in both size and capability. Most US yards, when the US were colonies, were used more for refitting and reprovisioning, more so than building. Although obviously during the American War of Independence, they did obviously also prove capable of building ships quite quickly and quite significantly, albeit on the smaller side of things, frigates and so forth. So yeah, I don't think there were any notable US yards during their time as colonies where they would stack up against something like Chatham or Portsmouth and go, yes, this is competitive. But then again, there are very few yards in the world that could stack up against something like Chatham or Portsmouth. But on the smaller scale, on an individual, we produced this sloop, brig, cutter, sixth rate, fifth rate size vessel, and compare it to, if you like, at that point, home built competitors. Then yeah, the US had some pretty nice shipyards, helped by some pretty nice natural materials in the area. So that's all the super chats for the minute. Right, it's 11:20, so yeah, I'm really feeling it. So unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to take too many questions from the chat. I will go... How long have we been going? 2 minutes, 2 hours 45. We'll try and get to 3. We'll try and get to 3 hours. So that's 15 minutes. I think that's fair, because at that point, otherwise, you're just going to see me slide off the screen unconscious, which is just going to be embarrassing for everybody. Chuck Marble and a few others, I've seen you asking, am I going to do a Halifax explosion video? Yes, I am. I am going to do something on the Halifax explosion. I managed to get a lot of very useful information while I was on my trip to Canada, and a lot of interesting photos as well. But it will take a while to produce, because I mean, I've only done one video on the US trip so far. So yeah, there's a fair bit of content to chew through there. Knight 6831, why did both 20th century HMS Hood suffer low freeboard problems? The first one, because they wanted to see what the comparison between the newfangled barbette style guns and the old style biscuit tin turrets was, and it turns out that with the old school turrets, in order to ensure stability, you had to drop the freeboards very low, and so you ended up with the pre-dreadnought HMS Hood. With the battle cruiser, that's a combination of the fact she sat slightly lower in the water than was ideal after completion. Her quarterdeck was pretty low anyway, and she was capable of very high speed, and as well, not just Hood, but when you look at photos of all sorts of ships moving at high speed, you see the bow wave, then the trough, as is the laws of physics. But wave, trough, crest, trough, there is then another crest, and obviously the hull form of the ship and the speed of the ship dictates where that wave is. It's not going to be in exactly the same place on the ship at any given time. It varies in location depending on how fast the ship is going, amongst other things. But with Hood in particular, and when you look at other British built battle cruiser hulls of around about the same period, when the ship's moving at speed and you get this trough appearing around about the mainmast just forward of the aft armament, naturally then the crest is shortly thereafter, and on Hood, when the crest is shortly thereafter, that crest comes up at the quarterdeck, which, as I said, is much lower, and you get water overwhelming the quarterdeck, and it gets a reputation as a wet ship when it's moving at high speed. You can actually see this in a number of photos of Hood, taken of Hood's aft when she is moving at speed, especially from on board Hood, and you can see there's water washing over the deck. It's completely sodden there, and then you look at the wider context of the photo and look out at the sea, and you realise the sea is nowhere near rough enough for this to be the natural sea state of things. It is actually, you know, part of the ship's own generated wake, not wake, the ship's own generated waveform. USS Grey Ghost, how would the USS Texas, after her final refit in World War II, affect the Battle of Jutland if they joined the British after being magic there and the British ran into her since she has early radar? Basically the same. It's basically the same thing as almost any World War II ship, and I say almost any World War II ship transported to Jutland has. Yes, her guns will be more accurate. Yes, her guns will do a lot of damage, but the single biggest asset that any World War II ship teleported back to Jutland has is radar. Assuming, of course, that it's a ship that actually had radar. Because that cuts through the gloom and the smoke and the haze, and that allows the ship to then tell the admiral on whichever side it's joined, in this case the British, exactly what the enemy are doing, even if you can't see them. And that obviates so many things that went wrong at Jutland, because if you have basically the ability to track wherever your opponent's going, especially in mist and at night, then the positioning of the British can, in this case, because Texas joined the British side, can be a lot closer to what it should ideally have been than, you know, as the historic. Nanami Kamiya asks, would you be willing to recreate some more fictional ships, kind of like you did with Thunderchild, such as Nautilus, Jolly Roger, etc.? To a limited degree, sure. But I think I would probably draw the line at them being somewhat akin to Thunderchild. Not necessarily in that they are ironclads, but in that they are clearly based within the technology capability of the time period, and therefore inferences from real life vessels can be drawn. Whereas something like Nautilus, whilst real life submarines were not too far off, a submarine of the type that Nautilus is described as is way away. In fact, you could argue that in some ways, if you interpret Nautilus through a mildly optimistic lens, the Jules Verne style Nautilus is something that we still haven't been able to match today. Synchro Score, surprised they didn't discover that issue in the model base, and this is referring to Hood. Hood was breaking a lot of new ground, and as of course she was heavily redesigned halfway through construction. So when people point out that there were various issues with Hood, it's not exactly surprising, considering that in many ways she, as wonderful as a ship as she was, and as powerful a ship as she actually was, in her time, she was also a huge bodge job, which is one of the reasons why the Admiralty cancelled the others, because, you know, even with more time to work with them, because the hulls weren't quite as advanced, there were so many changes, they thought it was better to just start over again. Captain Seafort asks, given the US Navy's lack of fast oilers, was there any consideration given to building the Sangamon class as merchant aircraft carriers rather than full escort carriers and retaining their oiler capability? Not that I'm aware of, largely on the grounds that the role of an escort carrier, as the Sangamon conversions were envisioned, and the role of an oiler were so diametrically separate that to halfway house it and end up with a ship that could do both wouldn't really help, because an oiler's position in the fleet and an escort carrier position in the fleet are so different that they basically, if you put them in one situation, they wouldn't be able to exercise the other half of their capability very easily. Although they did retain some additional oil tanks, so they kind of got put into this refueling at sea scenario anyway. But it was a lot more kind of an ad hoc on the spot thing rather than doing the full fleet oiler job. Gray goes, Texas has a slower speed, yes, but Texas's speed is the same as the rest of the Royal Navy's battle line, at least for the hours that it would matter. How are we doing time-wise? Right. Charlemagne 038, the most capable of the US Navy ironclads on the rivers during the American Civil War. That is a whole video in and of itself. I mean, I've done a couple of videos about the ironclad and other river warfare in the US Civil War, but analysing the capabilities of the various types of ironclad on the rivers, that's a whole comparative video in and of itself. Kevin Kennelly, bodge job. It's a British term that is kind of related to the fact that most of our decent inventions come from madmen in sheds. A bodge job is basically, we have this thing, and theoretically it's broken, and we could in theory repair it or complete it by using lots of high technology and lots of specialist equipment and so forth. Or I could take a hammer and nails and hit it enough times that it will vaguely enough hold together for long enough to do its job before it probably inevitably explodes. There's a reason why it was a UK company that invented the idea of the 40k orcs. They got hit it enough times with a hammer until it works. A lot of British wartime inventions, you look at them and they are kind of a halfway house between Jeremy Clarkson and a literal 40k mech. Orc mech. Yeah. Han Vu, I think. If Admiral Fisher orders the Courageous and Furious, and presumably Glorious, as aircraft carriers, how does this affect the Royal Navy? Well, I mean, if they're dedicated aircraft carriers from the ground up, that almost certainly means they have improved aircraft capability in terms of they're able to handle more aircraft. Interestingly enough, if they're ordered as aircraft carriers from the start, it probably means no Vanguard because there won't be any spare 15-inch turrets lying around. But yeah, I mean, it gives the Royal Navy much better aircraft carrier capability from the start. The interesting thing is, given that Courageous and Glorious both saw active service with the ground fleet, if they're built as carriers, and then you've got Furious joining later, how does that affect how quickly at the time Royal Navy Air Service can acquire aircraft to go on them? Because one of the reasons that the great planned torpedo strike on the High Seas Fleet by aircraft doesn't happen is because the Sopwith Cuckoo hasn't been built in large enough numbers yet. If the Royal Navy has some big flight deck aircraft carriers out there waiting for aircraft, could that whole situation or some equivalent thereof have been potentially accelerated? So yeah, that it would have a significant effect on the Royal Navy. I think the larger effect would be whether or not that attack actually happens, because if the attack doesn't happen, then the Royal Navy has some better aircraft carriers going into the interwar period, but by the time you get to the Second World War, they're still very old carriers, whereas if that strike does happen, it could completely change the Royal Navy's outlook on how things should happen and what they should plan for during the interwar period, which excuse me, might also make them want to hang on to the fleet air arm. It might make them fight for that a bit more as well. Redstone Builder, best heavy refit / rebuild battleships in your opinion? Personally, I'd have to say Valiant -QE. The West Virginia's refit is certainly the most anti-aircraft, or one of the most anti-aircraft capable. The Cavors are one of the fastest ones, but you can point to weaknesses in each. So the Cavors don't have a lot of heavy firepower, and their AA battery is kind of middling. West Virginia is bristling with firepower, both anti-aircraft and surface, but is quite slow. Whereas the full QE refits, IQE and Valiant, they've got enough speed to be somewhat useful on the front, on the straight up front lines. They've still got decent firepower and they've got decent AA. So they would strike me as the best full rebuilds. At least that's the way I would see it. Aluminium fence, any chance of a collab with Rex's hangar? I'd have to look them up, but in principle, I'm not opposed to collaborations as long as I can do a reasonable amount of research into who I'm collaborating with before I actually do that. And it's just gone 3 hours, so I'm going to take the 3 more questions and then wrap it up. Chuck Marble, if you were in charge of picking one single naval battle in all of naval history as a big budget blockbuster film, which naval battle would you choose and why? Ooh. One. You've really got me torn there. One battle, it will be a 3-way split between Jutland, Trafalgar, and Samar. I'd have to invent a 3-sided coin and then check whether it came up heads, tails, or warp portal, and that would be those would be my choice. I don't think I could at this point. I don't think I could pick any single one. They all have attractions. Chipper Corgi asks, I've heard you reference quad 16-inch auto-loading turrets planned for the Lion class a few times. Was there any chance such a thing would have worked? I think it was triples, but regardless. Theoretically, there's nothing stopping a 16-inch autoloader working. Practically, given the issues that they had when you look at getting small caliber autoloaders to work, then getting the 3-inch and the 6-inch to theoretically work, and then getting the 8-inch to work. Every time they scaled it up, it got quite difficult to fix the issues. I'd say, strictly speaking, there's nothing that says the late 1940s technology couldn't make a 16-inch autoloader. But that's very much on the theoretical. Whether they would practically have pulled it off in a way that didn't end in disaster every 5 loading cycles or so is another matter entirely. Right. And then I'm going to get the last question for today. Sorry guys, I'd love to keep going, but 1, it's 20 to midnight, and 2, as I said, I've had an incredibly tiring and stressful day, and I'm on the verge of passing out. So yeah, sorry Charlotte Hawkins. Best how to get answers. Well, you can email me, Discord message me, or if you're lucky, you could catch one of the more general take questions from chat live streams as opposed to the Patreon ones. It's just, unfortunately, there's not been the time for those recently. But yeah, that would be the answer. Sorry, I can never answer everybody in one of these. There's just so many questions. But I do my, well, I think 3 hours kind of shows I do my best there. So last one, Charlemagne 038, is a video on Admiral Fisher possible at some time in the future? Yes, actually. So there is a video on Admiral Fisher coming. That will be in collaboration with Matthew Wright. So if you remember the video I did on HMS New Zealand, that was Matthew Wright. He authored a book on HMS New Zealand, which we discussed on there, and he's done an awful lot of work on Admiral Fisher as well. So I'll be working with him on that, because that should prove to be very, very fun. So Jason Archer telling me that to go to sleep, and everyone else telling me to get some sleep as well. Okay, fine, I can take a hint. I will go and get some sleep and try to be alive for tomorrow. And thanks very much for showing up, everybody. And yeah, see you next time. Probably not too long, because now in a couple of days we're turning over into August, so I've got to worry about Drydock 208's live stream in a week or two. Anyway, see you later. Bye.